Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was a warm night in late June, one of those evenings where the air feels thick but not uncomfortable. I was sitting on the porch after dinner, just letting the house cool off before heading to bed. I live a few miles outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma, on a quiet stretch of land. Not farmland exactly, but enough open space to see the horizon in every direction. My dog, Boone, was lying by my feet, half asleep, twitching every now and then like he was dreaming. The sky was perfectly clear. Not a single cloud, just that deep, endless blue-black you get on summer nights. You could see the Milky Way faintly, which always made me pause a bit. I don't get many nights like that anymore. No wind, no bugs buzzing, just the steady hum of crickets and the occasional bark from somewhere down the road. I was halfway through a beer when I noticed the plane. It was coming from the west, a small blinking light, moving slow and steady, probably cruising at 30,000 feet. I've always liked watching them pass, wondering where they're going, who's on them, that sort of thing. This one looked normal at first, steady white light, faint red on the tail. It took maybe 30 seconds before I realized it wasn't moving anymore. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, that I'd lost perspective or the plane had turned toward me. But after another minute, it was clear it had stopped, just hung there in the sky, perfectly still. No movement, no sound. I leaned forward in my chair and shaded my eyes like that would help. Boone lifted his head and gave a low, uncertain grunt. The light didn't flicker like a star or blink like an aircraft beacon. It just glowed. A dull, steady white. I remember thinking maybe it was a helicopter hovering, but it was too high up, and besides, I would have heard it. The air was dead calm. Even distant highway noise carried that night. There was nothing. I got up and stepped off the porch into the yard. The grass was cool and damp, and I kept my eyes locked on that light. It didn't shift or drift. It stayed fixed in one exact spot. Then, without warning, the stars around it seemed to bend. That's the only way I can describe it. Like the patch of sky around it warped slightly, as if seen through heat haze, except the air was cool. The stars near it wobbled for a second, and then the light was gone. Just gone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the sky. No streak, no fade out. It didn't move away. It simply wasn't there anymore. Boone got up and started pacing, sniffing the air and whining. His tail was down. I went back to the porch and sat down, still looking at the spot where it had been. After a while, I convinced myself it was a trick of the eyes. Maybe the plane turned its lights off or banked hard and disappeared into the darkness. I even laughed a little, trying to brush it off. But about 10 minutes later, I noticed something else. The crickets had stopped. The silence was sudden and total. Even Boone froze mid-step. I could hear the electricity humming through the security light at the side of the house, that faint, high-pitched buzz you only notice when everything else goes quiet. I waited. Nothing. No frogs, no night birds, no distant highway hum. Just that high, thin electrical sound. Then Boone growled, low and deep, not at anything in particular. His ears were up, nose pointed toward the tree line beyond the pasture. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anything, just the faint outline of cottonwoods against the sky. I called his name softly, but he didn't move. A few seconds later, the security light flickered. Not the usual on-off motion when a moth hits the sensor, but a slow pulse, like it was dimming and brightening in rhythm. Boone backed up until his body pressed against my leg. I remember feeling the vibration of his growl in my calf. The air felt heavy. Not humid heavy, but dense somehow, like pressure had dropped all at once. Then everything snapped back. The crickets started up again in a rush, the light steadied. Boone barked once, sharp and loud. I flinched, and when I looked back at the sky, the stars were perfectly normal. No bending, no haze, just the same old sky. I stood there for a while, trying to settle my breathing. After a few minutes, I went back inside. Boone followed immediately, which he doesn't usually do. He likes to stay out late in the summer. Inside, the kitchen clock said 9:47. I remember because I checked my phone too, thinking maybe I'd been out there longer than I thought. My phone said 9:36. 10 minutes difference. I don't know why that unsettled me as much as it did. Maybe because both were digital clocks, no batteries to run down or anything. I reset the kitchen one to match the phone, but that detail stuck in my head all night. I tried to sleep but kept waking up. Around 1 in the morning, I heard Boone growl again from the foot of the bed. I turned on the lamp. He was standing there facing the window, ears forward, every muscle tight. I didn't see anything outside, just darkness and my reflection in the glass. But when I turned the lamp off again, there was a faint glow outside, high above the trees. It wasn't bright enough to light the ground, just a pale white circle hanging in the sky where the plane had been earlier. It looked farther away this time, dimmer, but it was there. I got up and went to the back door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch again. Boone stayed inside. The light didn't move. I watched it for what felt like a long time, maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't tell if it was getting smaller or dimmer or if my eyes were just tired. Then the stars around it warped again, the same way as before, like ripples in water. And then, once more, it disappeared. That was the last time I saw it that night. The next morning, I checked the clock in the kitchen again. It was wrong by exactly 10 minutes, behind the phone this time. I reset it again, and it's been fine ever since. I went out to the yard after breakfast and just stood there, staring at the sky like an idiot. It was bright blue, normal. A few thin clouds moving in from the west. I walked out toward the pasture where Boone had been fixated. Nothing unusual, no tracks, no burned patches, no smell, just grass and dirt. But when I looked down near the porch steps, I noticed something strange. There was a thin layer of white dust on the wood, like fine ash. Not pollen, not sand. It brushed off easily, didn't smell like anything, but it left faint, shiny specks on my fingertips. I wiped it away and didn't think much more about it until later that week when I told my neighbor Curtis about what I'd seen. He laughed at first, said maybe I'd seen a satellite or one of those Starlink things, but when I mentioned the stars bending, he went quiet. Then he said, "You're not the first to say something like that." I asked what he meant, and he told me his wife had called him outside late one night last year because she'd seen a bright star hanging too low, above their barn. When he came out, it was gone. He said the weird part was their motion light had been flickering for 10 minutes straight, and their dogs wouldn't go near the back fence for days after. I didn't say much else after that, just nodded and changed the subject. It's been a few months now. Nothing strange has happened since, though every time I sit outside at night, I find myself watching the same part of the sky without meaning to. Sometimes I think I catch a faint shimmer, like the air moving differently for just a second. But maybe it's my eyes playing tricks. Boone doesn't like staying out late anymore. Around 9 or so, he starts pawing at the door, ready to come inside even if it's cool out. He never used to do that. The porch still gets that fine dust sometimes, just a trace of it, even after I sweep. I stop checking the clock at night. I figure if anything wants to mess with my time, it can do it while I'm asleep. It was late August, one of those nights that still feels like summer, but has that slight cool edge that reminds you it's almost over. We were camping out at Lake Marston, not a real campground, just this open field near the water where people park trucks and light fires. No cell service, no lights for miles. The sky there always looks huge. There were 4 of us, me, my friend Caleb, his girlfriend Mara, and this guy from her work named Tyler. We'd spent most of the night drinking cheap beer, cooking hot dogs, and talking about dumb stuff. Around midnight, Caleb suggested lying back to watch the stars since the Perseids were supposed to be peaking that week. We all sprawled out on blankets and stared up. The fire had burned low to red embers. The sky was ridiculously clear, that kind of dark blue-black where you can see depth between the stars. Every few minutes, someone would point out a shooting star. We must have seen a dozen of them. The one that stuck with me wasn't right, though. It was a little after 1 when it happened. Caleb had just gone to grab another beer from the cooler, and I was lying on my back, watching the tree line. I saw a bright spot near Cassiopeia start to move. It wasn't a plane, no blinking lights, and it was higher, sharper. It cut across the sky faster than any of the other meteors we'd seen. Everyone saw it. Mara said, "There's another one." and we all turned to follow it. But it didn't burn out, it slowed. I remember that clearly. The light, a white, slightly bluish point, just stopped moving, hanging in one spot. No fade, no trail. It looked exactly like a bright star that had decided to pause mid-fall. Tyler laughed at first, said something about it being a satellite. But satellites don't stop like that. And this thing wasn't drifting, it was dead still. Then it moved again, only not in a straight line. It darted sideways, fast, like how a fly changes direction midair. Then it stopped again, hovered. The motion was so sharp it didn't look natural. It jumped left, then right, then up a bit, almost like it was testing space. We all sat up, nobody said anything for a second. Caleb said, "What the hell is that?" The light stayed in one spot for maybe 20 seconds, completely motionless, before it started gliding slowly downward. Not falling, just lowering itself, like it was being pulled on a string. I don't know how to describe it better than that. It didn't flicker, didn't change size, just sank lower until it was behind the tree line. Mara asked if it could be a drone, but we were at least 15 miles from the nearest town, and the thing had been at an altitude where planes cruise. I said maybe a plane turning, but nobody answered. We sat there another minute, waiting for something else to happen. I remember the fire crackling and that faint sound of crickets. Then, right when Caleb stood up, the air around us got weird. Not loud, not windy, but thick somehow, like pressure before a storm. My ears popped. The fire sputtered, just once, like it sucked in. We all noticed it. Mara said, "Do you feel that?" And then the light came back. Not above us this time, but way out past the lake, over the water. A glowing orb, maybe the size of a pencil eraser from where we sat. It was bright, but not blinding, that same bluish-white color. It hovered low, maybe a few hundred feet above the surface. No reflection on the water, which was strange because everything else, the stars, the moon, reflected perfectly. We watched it in silence. Then it moved again, tracing a slow line parallel to the shoreline. The motion wasn't smooth. It would slide a few inches, stop, then slide again. Each movement was perfectly level, like it was scanning something. Tyler said we should try filming it. He took out his phone and pointed it, but when he opened the camera, the screen stayed black. I tried mine. Same thing. The camera app would open, then just freeze. Caleb's wouldn't even load. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The thing wasn't close enough to be threatening, but something about it didn't sit right. The quiet felt wrong, like the night itself was holding its breath. We stayed like that for a few minutes. Then, all at once, the orb shot straight up. Not fast at first, but accelerating in a smooth curve until it vanished into the sky. No sound, no streak, just gone. We all exhaled at once, like we'd been waiting for something to explode. Caleb said, "Okay, that was definitely not a plane." Nobody argued. Tyler tried the camera again. It worked fine now. I checked the time, 1:26 a.m. I remember that because we all had looked earlier, right after the first streak, and it had only been 1:09 then. 19 minutes felt too long for what had just happened, but not impossible. Still, I swear it hadn't felt like that much time had passed. After that, the mood died. We put out the fire and sat in Caleb's truck talking quietly, mostly just trying to make sense of it. Mara said it might have been military. Caleb said maybe ball lightning. Tyler didn't say much at all. Around 3, we all tried to sleep. I couldn't. I kept watching through the truck window at where the light had been. Nothing moved, but the stars looked strange. Not wrong exactly, just off, like the patterns had shifted slightly. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is sunlight. Everyone else was asleep. I got out to take a piss by the tree line, and I noticed something odd. A patch of grass near where we'd had the fire was flattened in a perfect circle, maybe 6 feet across. Not burned, not wet, just pressed down flat like something had hovered low above it. I didn't mention it right away. We packed up, left by mid-morning. Nobody said much on the drive home. Caleb dropped me off at my place and texted later asking if I'd slept okay. He said Mara had a headache all morning, and Tyler claimed he'd had a weird dream about bright lights over water. That evening, I pulled my phone from the charger and noticed a new photo in my gallery. I hadn't taken any. The thumbnail looked black, but when I tapped it, there was this faint gray image, almost like it had been taken in total darkness, but with the exposure turned way up. At the center was a smudge of light. Not a shape, not even a circle, just a blur, bluish white like the thing we'd seen. The timestamp said 1:25 a.m. I didn't show it to them. Over the next few nights, I kept checking the sky at home. I live near the edge of town, so it's not totally dark, but still clear enough. I saw normal planes, satellites, the occasional meteor, nothing out of place. Until the fourth night. I was letting the dog out around 10:30 when I noticed a small, bright point hovering way higher than anything else. I thought maybe it was Venus, but it moved, just slightly, a short twitch to the left, then back. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for it to blink like a plane, but it didn't. After maybe a minute, it faded. I haven't seen anything like that since, but sometimes when I'm outside late, the sky looks different to me. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to make me pause. Like I'm not quite sure which dots used to be where. I still have that photo. Every time I try to brighten or zoom in, the whole image corrupts and turns gray. Only that faint, cold light stays visible, sitting there in the middle of the dark like it's waiting for something to notice it. I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was that jarring alarm tone I always forget to change, the one that sounds like a smoke detector. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen. 5:03 a.m. The alarm said weekday wake up, but that one wasn't set to go off until 6. I checked the clock on my wall to make sure my phone hadn't just glitched. It matched. 5:03. I lay there for a second, disoriented, trying to figure out if maybe I'd accidentally changed the alarm yesterday. I hadn't. It was a Thursday in early March. I remember that because it had rained all night and the air coming through my cracked window was cold and damp. My neighborhood, a quiet stretch outside Asheville, stays dark that early. No streetlights near my house, just a long gravel driveway, some pine trees, and a view of the backyard that sloped toward the woods. I didn't hear any unusual sounds, just the occasional drip off the roof and the faint hum of my mini fridge. I almost went back to sleep, but I was already half awake, and I figured I'd just get up and make coffee. The kitchen light flickered once when I turned it on, like the power had dipped, but everything else seemed fine. I didn't think much of it. I made my coffee, fed the dog, Daisy, and stood by the sliding glass door that looked out over the yard. The fog was thick, the kind that sits low to the ground where you can see it moving slowly, curling around the fence posts. I checked the weather app. It said sunrise was supposed to be at 6:42. The app clock said 5:08. Everything matched up. So the phone's internal clock wasn't off, just the alarm. I thought maybe it updated wrong during daylight saving or something, but we weren't near that date. I sat down at the table, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. A few minutes later, I noticed Daisy was standing in the hallway, staring toward the back door. Ears up, tail low. She didn't bark, which was weird for her. Just stood there with that frozen, listening posture. I turned off the kitchen light to see outside better, but the fog swallowed everything past the porch light's reach. It wasn't silent exactly. There was that soft, white noise fog seems to make when it dampens everything else. But underneath it, I thought I heard something faint, like a low hum. It wasn't constant, more like a pulse. It came and went, every few seconds. I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, coffee still in hand. The air was colder than I expected and wet enough to feel like mist on my skin. The sound was real, but I couldn't tell where it came from. It wasn't mechanical, not like a generator or plane. It was just this steady, low vibration that I felt more than I heard. Daisy whined from inside, so I went back in. I shut the door, stood there a minute, and then the hum stopped completely. I went about my morning like normal after that. Made eggs, packed my work bag, left the house a little after 7. The day itself was fine. Normal, even. I didn't think much about the alarm thing until that night. When I got home around 6:30, it was already getting dark. I took Daisy out back and threw the ball for her a few times. The grass was still soggy from the night before, and my shoes got soaked. I went inside, kicked them off, and started dinner. Later, when I was scrolling through my photos looking for a picture from last weekend, I noticed one I didn't recognize. It was between 2 photos I'd taken days earlier, same folder, same timeline, but time-stamped at 5:04 a.m. that morning. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally taken it while half asleep. It was grainy, kind of blurry, but it looked like it was taken through my kitchen window. The angle matched where I'd stood when I looked out into the fog earlier. Only the weird part was the light. In the middle of the photo was this faint blue glow over the yard. Not bright, not like headlights or a phone flash. Softer, almost hazy. The light seemed to spread low across the ground like mist that was somehow lit from beneath. I zoomed in, but that just made it worse. There were no shapes or figures, nothing visible as a source. Just the faintest circular gradient fading into the fog. I checked the details, 5:04 a.m. Camera app. Location matched my house. Exposure 1 second, which was strange because I don't think my phone had been out of my hand since the alarm went off. I checked my security camera too. I've got one pointed toward the backyard, motion triggered. There was no alert, no recording between 2:17 a.m. and 6:41 a.m. I manually checked the feed for that time window anyway, and it was just black, like the camera hadn't been getting power. That unsettled me. I tested it, walked into the yard, motion light triggered fine. Everything worked. That night, I couldn't shake it. I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see that same glow. Around 11, I went outside with a flashlight and walked to the fence line. The fog had come back, thicker than before. My light didn't reach far. The ground squelched with every step. Then I heard that low hum again, faint like before, but now it seemed closer. I turned off the flashlight to listen. The fog swallowed everything. The sound wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It just surrounded me. And then I noticed something else. Daisy had gone completely quiet inside. Usually, if I'm outside at night, she's barking or scratching at the door. Not this time. Just silence. I backed toward the porch, scanning the fog. My eyes started playing tricks. I thought I saw faint movements in the mist, darker patches shifting where there shouldn't have been any. I froze and held my breath. Nothing solid ever appeared, but the sense that something was there, just out of sight, got stronger. I went inside. The next morning, my alarm went off again at exactly 5:03 a.m. I hadn't touched the settings. I checked. It was still labeled weekday wake up, set for 6. The sound played from the same speaker, same tone, everything. I turned it off, but the unease sat in my chest all day. That evening, I tried taking new photos of the yard at the same time. Nothing strange showed up. The fog had lifted, sky was clear. The following weekend, I showed the picture to my friend Laura, who's into photography. She looked at it for a long time and said the color temperature didn't make sense. She said if it had been a porch light or reflection, the pixels wouldn't distribute that evenly. She also said it didn't look like lens flare or camera movement. It's like there's a light source, but the air itself is glowing, she said. I haven't been able to recreate it since. One small thing that keeps bothering me, though, the morning after that first incident, I found a thin line in the dirt along the back fence. It was perfectly straight, like something had dragged a stick through it. Maybe a foot deep, running from one corner of the yard to the other. The next day, it was gone, like it had been filled in. I don't know if it's connected, but I hadn't noticed it before. Since then, every few nights, the power flickers between 5 and 5:10 a.m. Sometimes my phone buzzes like it's getting a silent notification. When I check, there's nothing. I stopped looking at the camera feed for a while, but when I finally checked again, a couple weeks later, there was one short clip from 5:05 a.m. The screen was mostly black, but for half a second, a faint blue haze passed across the frame, then static. It didn't happen again. Now, the only time I ever wake up before dawn, I can't bring myself to look out the window. The fog rolls through the backyard the same way it did that morning, soft and quiet, and the air has that same low hum if you really listen for it. So faint, you could almost convince yourself it's nothing at all. I camped alone a few miles north of Gold Beach, Oregon, last August. I'd been driving down the coast after visiting a friend in Portland, just taking my time before heading back to Sacramento. I like finding little hidden pull-offs or quiet beaches that don't show up on maps. This one was a narrow strip of sand below a bluff, maybe half a mile from the nearest trailhead. You could only reach it by hiking down a rough, overgrown path. It was late afternoon when I set up camp. There was no one else around, not even footprints. The tide was out, the air felt heavy, and the fog hung just offshore like a wall. I remember thinking how strange the quiet was. No birds, no insects, not even the usual distant hum of highway traffic, just waves. I pitched my tent maybe 40 yards from the waterline on the flattest part of the sand. The sky turned orange, then gray, and by the time I started a small fire, it was already cooling off fast. I cooked a bit of rice and canned chili, had a beer, and listened to the ocean. Sometime after dark, I saw a light over the water. At first, I thought it was a fishing boat, a single white light, low and steady. But after a few minutes, it started moving, not in a straight line, but kind of in short, slow arcs. It wasn't bright enough to reflect on the water, but it seemed to hover just above it. I tried to convince myself it was a helicopter or a drone, though it didn't have that red-green flashing pattern. Just one pale white glow. It disappeared suddenly, like someone flicked a switch. I remember checking my watch, 10:17 p.m., and deciding I'd had enough staring into the dark. I put out the fire and zipped into my tent. The sound of the waves was steady, rhythmic. I must have fallen asleep fast. What woke me wasn't a noise exactly, more like the absence of one. The ocean had gone silent. No surf, no wind. I sat up and listened. My tent was glowing faintly from the moonlight outside, but it felt wrong somehow, like the air was too still. Then I heard this faint popping sound. Tiny, irregular, all around me. It reminded me of someone pressing a finger into wet sand. That soft suction sound. Over and over. I froze, thinking maybe the tide had come in further than I realized and the water was reaching the tent. But when I unzipped the flap and looked out, the tide was still far out. The beach was dry. The popping continued, spaced out and random, but definitely close. I clicked on my headlamp and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just smooth, untouched sand. I turned the light off and sat there for a while, trying to hear past the ringing in my ears. The popping faded eventually, and I must have dozed off again. When I woke up, it was just before dawn. The air was damp, and fog drifted in thick sheets across the beach. Everything was gray-blue, quiet except for the faintest ripple of waves. I stepped outside barefoot, stretching, and that's when I saw the holes. Hundreds of them. They covered the sand in a spiral pattern around my tent. Not random, not scattered, but precise. Each hole was maybe 2 inches wide and 3 or 4 inches deep, perfectly round, the sides smooth like they'd been drilled. They started far out, maybe 30 yards from the tent, then curved inward in a slow, widening loop until they stopped just a few feet from where I'd been sleeping. At first, I thought some kind of burrowing crab or clam had done it, but I'd camped on beaches all my life and never seen anything that uniform. The sand between the holes was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, just that spiral of tiny, perfect holes. I walked toward the water, following the pattern. As I got closer to the shoreline, the holes grew shallower and narrower until they vanished near the edge of the wet sand. Beyond that, nothing. The tide hadn't reached them yet. I crouched and scooped some sand from one of the holes. It was compacted like it had been pressed from underneath. The bottom was hard and smooth. I stuck my finger in. It fit snugly, but I couldn't feel any shell or rock, just dense, cool sand. I took a few pictures with my phone, but they didn't come out well. The fog dulled everything. You could barely see the spiral in the photos. Still, I knew what I was looking at. It was deliberate. Then I noticed the holes nearest the tent had filled slightly with condensation. Little beads of water shimmered inside, perfectly still. The sand around them was dry. When the sun started breaking through the fog, I packed up. I didn't even eat breakfast. The whole time I kept glancing back at the spiral. From a few yards away, it looked almost beautiful, like some kind of design you'd find in a crop field, precise but natural. I climbed back up the bluff and looked down one last time before heading to my car. From above, the spiral was even clearer, wide arcs tightening toward the center where my tent had been. Driving south, I stopped at a small gas station near Brookings. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd lived there forever, so I asked if he knew about any strange patterns or burrowing animals on the beaches north of town. He frowned and said maybe sand crabs, but when I showed him one of the photos, he shook his head. Too neat, he said. Maybe kids messing around. Except there hadn't been any other footprints. That stuck with me the rest of the day. When I got home, I transferred the photos to my laptop. Under better light, you could see the spiral faintly, and light, though most of the holes just looked like shadows. I zoomed in on one section and realized something I hadn't noticed out there. The holes weren't spaced evenly. They were getting closer together toward the center, like something had been tightening its path as it went. A week later, I tried to find that beach again using satellite view. I thought maybe I could pinpoint where I'd camped by matching the bluff's shape, but the shoreline looked different in every photo. The cliffs had collapsed in places, the sandbars had shifted. It's a stretch of coast that changes fast. I called my friend in Portland and told him about it. He joked that maybe I'd stumbled onto some natural phenomenon, or worse, some art project I'd ruined by camping there. But even he admitted it didn't sound right. That night, I dreamed of the sound, that soft popping like air escaping the earth. I woke up sweating, certain I'd heard it again. My apartment was quiet, but for a few seconds I thought I could feel something faint under the floor, a slow, rhythmic pressure. The next morning, I went to wash my tent before putting it away. The sand that clung to the bottom was damp and darker than the rest, even though the tent had been dry when I packed it. I rinsed it off and watched the grains swirl down the drain, small flecks of black mixed with tan. When the water cleared, the sink smelled faintly metallic, like rust. I didn't think much of it then, but a few days later I noticed faint circular impressions on the bottom of the tent's footprint, tiny shallow rings pressed into the material. Not from rocks or sticks. They were too even, too round. I threw the footprint away. I still have the pictures though. Every once in a while I look at them again, trying to convince myself the spiral wasn't as precise as I remember. Maybe it was an illusion, or maybe I was half asleep when I saw it. But the pattern doesn't fade when I look. It gets clearer. Each time I notice something new, a slight shimmer in the sand like heat mirage around the holes nearest the center. It's faint, barely visible, but it's there. I haven't gone camping since. I was hiking alone that day, a Sunday in early September, on a stretch of forest outside Randall, Washington. It was warm but overcast, the kind of day where the sky looks like brushed aluminum and sound doesn't carry far. I'd driven out from Tacoma that morning just to get a few hours away from people. The plan was simple: take the Ridgeview Loop, maybe 4 miles total, snap a few photos, head back before dark. I'd done that trail twice before. It's not popular, no big views, no waterfalls, just quiet pines, moss, and this old logging road that cuts through the middle. You can hear birds the whole time, but rarely see them. About an hour in, I stopped to drink some water and noticed something odd on a tree just off the path. It was one of those trail cameras, the camouflaged kind hunters use, about shoulder height, strapped around the trunk with a frayed nylon belt. It looked weathered but not ancient, like it had been there maybe a few months. Nothing unusual about that, except it was facing directly toward the trail, not a game trail, the actual human hiking path. It wasn't hidden either. It almost felt like it was meant to be seen. I figured maybe the Forest Service was monitoring traffic or wildlife, but there weren't any posted notices like there usually are for that kind of thing. The camera had a brand name on it, Wild Trail, I think, and one of those little black lenses that looks like an insect eye. Out of curiosity, I stepped closer. The front panel was slightly open, and I could see the SD card slot. I hesitated, then told myself it was probably fine to check. I wasn't planning to take anything, just look. So I flipped the latch and slid the card out. It was warm to the touch. That stuck with me. Everything else, the bark, the strap, the air, was cool. But that little SD card felt like it had been sitting near a heat source. I put it in my phone using an adapter I keep in my pack for photography. The card had one folder labeled DCIM with a ton of image files inside. The first few looked normal: trees, empty trail, deer. Some had timestamps from the previous week. But when I scrolled further, I froze. The newer ones, maybe the last 15 or 20, were of me. Not just me hiking either. Me in that exact section of the trail. There was one of me walking past a stump I could see right there, one of me adjusting my backpack, and another of me kneeling to tie my shoe. All taken from slightly different angles, like the camera had moved. The timestamps were the worst part. The most recent one was from 7 minutes ago. My first thought was that someone had been following me with another camera, maybe pranking hikers. But I hadn't heard anyone, and there was only one set of footprints on the dirt, mine. I pulled the SD card out fast and looked around. The forest was completely still, even the birds were quiet. I stood there listening for maybe a full minute, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to start walking again, a metallic clicking sound came from deeper in the trees. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards off, but it was distinct, like something small, snapping shut. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing. I tried again, louder, still nothing. After a moment, I convinced myself it had to be an animal, maybe another old trail cam going off or a branch falling. I slipped the SD card back into the camera, closed it, and stepped back onto the path. For the next 20 minutes, I hiked fast, faster than usual. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone, but the trail stayed empty. My phone showed no signal. When I finally hit the clearing, where the loop joins the old logging road, I stopped to breathe. There's a wooden bench there, half rotted, and I sat for a second to calm down. The air felt heavy, humid, but cold at the same time. That's when I noticed another camera. This one was on a pole near the tree line, newer looking, black plastic that still had gloss to it. It was aimed straight at the bench. No way it was coincidence. I didn't even go near it, just turned and kept walking. Every sound made me jump. A branch cracking, a squirrel darting through the leaves, all of it. My nerves were shot. After maybe half a mile, the forest started to thin and the gravel parking lot came into view. I felt this huge wave of relief seeing my car. But as I got closer, I noticed something on my windshield. A small rectangular piece of black plastic, the back panel of a trail camera. It had the same pattern, the same screws. There was dirt on it, like it had been ripped off a tree. I looked around the lot. My car was the only one there. No other vehicles, no sign of people. The forest line behind me looked empty, but I didn't stay to study it. I tossed my pack in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. The drive out felt longer than it should have. The road's mostly one-lane gravel, and the fog had started rolling in from the foothills, patchy but dense. My hands kept tightening on the wheel every time I saw movement at the edges of the trees. A few miles out, my radio cut out mid-song. Not static, just dead silence. Then the display froze. No numbers, no station. I hit the buttons, but it stayed blank until I turned it off completely. When I looked back up at the road, there was a figure standing on the shoulder. Not close enough to see details, just a person, I think, or maybe a post. But it was facing the road, unmoving. I slowed a little, heart pounding again, and when I passed, it wasn't there. Nothing at all. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the main highway and didn't pull over until I saw other cars again. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been watching me. I checked my phone, went through the photos I'd taken that day, the ones from my own camera. They were fine. Normal. Trees, trail markers, a close-up of a fern. Then while scrolling, I noticed a thumbnail I didn't recognize. I tapped it. It was a photo of me, from behind, walking down the trail. The angle looked identical to one of the shots I'd seen on the SD card. Same lighting, same position. But the timestamp was from after I'd left. It shouldn't have been there. I'd deleted the other card's contents from my phone, and this wasn't from my camera roll that day. I locked the screen and set the phone down, trying to tell myself it was a glitch, a cache file, something explainable. I went to bed late and didn't sleep much. Every creak in the house made me tense. Around 3 a.m., I heard my porch motion light flick on. It happens sometimes when raccoons wander through, but after everything, I got up to check. When I looked out the window, the yard was empty, just the grass glowing pale under the porch light. Except for one thing. Leaning against the far side of my fence was another camera. The same kind. Camo plastic, black lens, strap hanging loose. I stared at it for a long time before going outside. When I finally did, it was gone. I don't know who put it there or how long it stayed, but I haven't been back to that trail since. And sometimes when I scroll through my phone, I swear new photos appear. Dark, grainy ones. Of trees I don't recognize, taken at times I know I was home. It happened last winter, in late January. I was living in Pine Hollow, a small town in northern Wisconsin, where winters are long and quiet. I work from home doing contract drafting, so my routine is pretty uneventful. Most evenings after dinner, I'd walk my dog, Scout. a big mixed breed mutt, down a snow-packed trail behind my neighborhood. It's not an official path, just a cut through between a few backyards that leads into a strip of public woods. It's dark there, but I've walked it so many times I could do it blindfolded. That night, there was no wind, and the snow made everything strangely bright under a cloudless sky. It was around 8:30 p.m. when we headed out. I had my heavy boots and gloves on, and Scout was tugging like always, eager to sniff the drifts and rabbit tracks. As soon as we crossed behind the last row of houses, the usual noises, TVs, muffled voices, disappeared. The woods aren't deep there, but they're enough to block out the neighborhood glow. I always bring a small flashlight, but I didn't need it. The moon wasn't full, but the snow was reflecting just enough light. About 10 minutes in, Scout stopped dead and stared at the tree line ahead. His ears went back. I thought he'd spotted a deer, but I didn't see anything. That's when I noticed the lights. Above the trees, maybe 100 yards ahead, 3 lights moved in a line. They were white, not bright like spotlights, but steady like stars. They were spaced evenly apart, forming a shallow triangle. At first, I thought it was a plane, maybe even 3 planes in formation, but they were too low for that, and the spacing never changed. No sound at all. I stood there, watching. The lights kept moving slowly, parallel to the tree line. I walked a few steps forward, and Scout hesitated but followed. The lights seemed to pause, like they were hovering. When I stopped, they stopped. I told myself it was a trick of perspective. Maybe they were much farther away than they looked. I tried to get my phone out to record it, but my gloves made it clumsy. By the time I had the camera open, the lights began drifting again, matching my pace. Scout whined. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, but I didn't know why yet. I started walking faster, eyes flicking between the lights and the snow under my boots. The triangle shifted slightly, almost like it was banking. Then, one by one, the lights tilted. At least that's how it appeared, like they were rotating around each other without breaking formation. No blinking, no color changes, just silent white dots moving deliberately. I reached the point where the trail forks. Usually I take the longer loop, but that night I turned back. As soon as I pivoted, the lights slid sideways, keeping the same distance but now moving behind me. Scout was pulling hard toward home. I stopped again, heart pounding, and the lights froze in place. It felt like they were watching me. I decided to test it. I walked 10 steps forward, then stopped. They moved, then stopped. I crouched down, pretending to adjust Scout's collar, and they hung there motionless. The snow was dead quiet. No crunch of animals, no wind, just my breathing and Scout's panting. I started walking again, faster now. My boots slipped on the packed snow, but I didn't care. I kept glancing back. The lights followed. Same distance, same formation. Halfway back to the houses, there's a small clearing where the trees thin out. When we broke into it, I got a clearer view of the sky. The lights weren't against the tree line anymore. They were higher, maybe 100 feet up, but still perfectly still. I couldn't make out any shape connecting them. No outline of wings or a fuselage, just those 3 dots. Then, without warning, the middle light dipped lower, slow and smooth, like it was descending. Scout growled low, a sound I've only heard from him once or twice. I felt every hair on my arms rise. The other 2 lights held their positions. I stumbled backward, trying to keep my eyes on it. It stopped midair, hovered for maybe 3 seconds, and shot back up to rejoin the other 2. No acceleration sound, no visible trail, just there one moment, back in formation the next. I don't know why, but I broke into a jog. Scout was practically dragging me. We cut back through the path, past the last row of trees. As soon as I stepped into the glow of the first porch light, I turned to look again. The lights were still there, but farther away now, moving slowly toward the north. They didn't blink or change direction. They just slid across the sky until the trees blocked my view. I didn't stop walking until I was in my yard. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the leash. Scout ran straight to the back door and pawed at it. I let him in and stood there for a minute, staring at the tree line. Nothing. I went inside, shut all the curtains, and tried to pull myself together. I checked my phone. The video I thought I'd been recording was just a black screen. My glove must have covered the lens. No sound either. Later that night, lying in bed, I noticed Scout was still restless. Every so often, he'd lift his head and look at the window. I finally got up and peeked outside. The sky was empty. but the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after. The next morning, I walked the same trail in daylight. The snow showed our prints, the fork where I turned around, even where I'd crouched. Everything looked normal. I told myself it must have been planes or drones, but I've seen planes at night my whole life, and nothing about those lights matched. For weeks after, Scout resisted going past the first part of the path. He'd plant his feet and look at the tree line, tail down. Eventually, he eased back into our routine, but even now, if we're out after dark, he keeps glancing up at the sky. I haven't seen the lights again. But sometimes on clear winter nights, I catch myself stopping under the trees, scanning the sky, half expecting them to be there. 3 silent points moving in formation, waiting for me to notice. I left town late, around 11, just me and the road. The sky was clear but low-hanging, the kind of dark that makes your headlights look feeble. I was driving back to my place in Bellwood after a long weekend at my parents' farm upstate. My car's heater was ticking along at a steady hum, and I had the windows down a crack to let in the cold air. There was no one else on the road, not a single other set of headlights for miles, which is normal out there, but that night it felt more like the world had gone hollow. I was about 10 miles past the last town when I noticed it. At first, it was just a glint off the grass at the edge of a field to my left. Then I saw it more clearly, a perfect circle, maybe 50 feet across, the grass pressed down in the most uniform way I've ever seen. It looked like someone had gone in with a giant rolling pin. My stomach did a small flip. I slowed, peering through the windshield, trying to convince myself it was just something normal. A patch of frost, a low mist, maybe even a crop circle prank. But it didn't look like frost, didn't look like mist. It was sharp, deliberate. I pulled over onto the shoulder and got out, shivering in the cold night air. The field was dark except where the moon hit, which made the circle shimmer faintly. I walked toward it, my boots crunching in the gravel. When I got closer, I could see the blades of grass bent perfectly outward from the center, like a ripple frozen in place. My first thought was that it had to be recent. Fresh dew on the tips, nothing trampled by animals. But I also noticed that around the edge, the ground seemed untouched, as if nothing had been near it at all. I circled it slowly, keeping my phone ready to take pictures. The beam from the flashlight made the circle's symmetry glow, and I swear I could see faint lines, almost like fingers pressed into the soil, radiating from the center. I shook my head. That was ridiculous. I didn't want to believe in anything bizarre, but I also couldn't explain it. I backed up to the car to get a wider shot. When I turned around to line up the camera, the circle was gone. Not partially, not distorted, completely gone. The grass was standing normal, the field just another patch of night-blurred green under the moonlight. My heart hammered in my chest. I blinked, thinking maybe it was my eyes playing tricks, the shadows and moonlight aligning for a brief moment. I drove forward a bit, turning onto the side dirt road that ran alongside the field, but it was just ordinary now. Nothing flattened, nothing remarkable. I shook my head and laughed nervously. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of perspective, the way fields can look different from angles at night. I was cold, my legs shaking, so I got back in the car, locked the doors, and kept going. About 5 miles down the road, I noticed a faint glow over the tree line. At first, I thought it was a farm or some lights left on in a barn, but the glow wasn't stationary. It moved slowly, like a pulse, fading in and out, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that didn't make sense. I stopped again, thinking I could see the pattern better. The road was pitch black behind me. The only sound, my engine idling and the soft whistle of wind through the trees. The glow moved slightly to the left, then vanished entirely as if it had been sucked into the tree line. I tried calling my parents just to hear a normal voice. No answer. I left a voicemail telling them I'd be home late. When I hung up, my phone screen flickered, bright for a second, then dimmed. I looked out at the road ahead, and the glow was back, closer now, barely over the horizon. I pulled the car over again, my hands on the wheel, staring. It stayed just at the edge of the trees, faint, almost translucent. There was no sound, just that persistent pulse of light, nothing else. After a few minutes, it darted sideways, almost like it had decided to move along a straight line, but then it stopped again. I drove a little closer, cautiously, feeling more like a voyeur than a traveler. The road curved, and when I rounded the bend, the glow was gone. Nothing. The trees were just trees, dark and solid. My mouth was dry, my skin prickling. I told myself it was probably a reflection, something mundane I couldn't identify, a farm light refracted through the mist, maybe a lens flare in my eyes, but that explanation felt hollow. The circle in the field, the precise geometry, the disappearing glow, they all lingered in my head. I kept glancing at the sky, expecting stars, but the moonlight was unusually sharp that night, casting long shadows that seemed wrong somehow, elongated in ways that made the trees look more menacing. By the time I got to the highway exit leading home, it was quiet again. I had the heat cranked and kept the radio on, music low, nothing too distracting. I watched the rearview mirror constantly. Every movement in the trees, every shifting shadow, made me tense. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, the kind of tension that feels like your bones are alert. When I finally turned into my driveway, nothing had followed. No lights, no glow, no flattened grass visible in the fields along the way. The streetlights flickered a little, normal in my neighborhood, and I parked. The house looked the same as always. Inside, everything smelled like wood polish and faint coffee from the morning. I made myself a cup and sat at the table, looking out the window at the yard, half expecting to see something odd reflected there. Nothing appeared. I checked the photos from my phone. The circle in the field didn't appear in any of them, not one frame. The glow over the tree line wasn't captured either, just the empty field, the road, and the normal darkness. I felt a pressure in my chest, the kind that happens when your mind knows something unexplainable happened, but you have nothing tangible to hold on to. I tried to sleep, but the images of that perfect circle and the pulsing light returned in fragments, like after images burned into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made the circle was still out there, watching, deliberate, and precise. I thought about going back during the day to see if there were any signs, but the thought of losing the odd quiet and the weight of that night made me hesitate. The next morning, the field was just a field. Grass was green, standing upright, entirely normal. I drove past slowly on my way to work. Nothing. No circle, no disturbance, nothing to mark the night as anything more than a memory. But the feeling lingered, the way the world could flicker just out of phase with itself, just long enough for you to glimpse something that shouldn't exist. I've driven that road countless times since, keeping my eyes open at night. I've seen animals pause, the mist shift in ways that feel wrong, shadows stretch too far, but nothing else like that night. And though I try to explain it all away, lights from a farmhouse, reflections, memory playing tricks, there's a part of me that remembers the precision of that circle. The way it was gone the moment I blinked, and the faint pulse over the trees that followed me for miles. It's a memory that doesn't fade, the kind that sits behind your eyes in the quiet moments, waiting. It started with my neighbor, Jeff. He's a regular guy, mid-50s, retired electrician. We weren't especially close, but we'd wave over the fence, borrow tools, that kind of thing. He lived alone after his wife moved to Arizona. Nothing about him screamed strange stories. So when he knocked on my door one night just before 11, looking pale and jittery, it caught me off guard. He said he'd just seen something above his backyard. He didn't call it anything specific, not a UFO, not a drone, just something. He kept saying it hovered, totally silent. I stepped outside with him. His backyard and mine run along the edge of a patch of woods, no streetlights back there, just darkness and tree silhouettes. The air was damp and cool, a little mist curling around the ground. He pointed straight up, right there, above those trees. I didn't see anything at first, just the usual stars, a faint orange glow from the town 10 miles away. Then I noticed an area where the stars weren't visible, like a patch of darker dark. It wasn't shaped like a plane or a helicopter. It was more like a flat oval, no edges, no lights, just absence. I thought it might be my eyes adjusting or a cloud drifting by, but it stayed still. The woods were quiet too, no insects, no frogs, no breeze. That hit me all at once, the silence. Usually at night you can hear at least something, but there was nothing. Jeff whispered, "It's been here 5 minutes." His voice shook. He was filming it with his phone, but the screen just showed black sky. He swore it had been lower before I came out. We both stood there staring. Then, slowly, the patch of darkness moved, not like a plane or bird, but like something sliding behind glass. It tilted, then shot straight up, no sound, no trail, and it was gone. The stars reappeared, just like that. Jeff lowered his phone. "Did you see that?" he asked. I said yes, but even as I said it, I was doubting myself. Maybe it was a trick of light, maybe we both imagined it. But we went back inside separately. I went to bed uneasy. The next morning, he knocked again. This time, he looked exhausted. He said something weird had shown up on his phone. He uses a GPS tracking app for his car, some anti-theft thing. When he checked it, it showed that between 2:11 a.m. and 3:17 a.m., his car had traveled in a perfectly straight line heading north, exactly 1 hour, 60 miles, then stopped. But his car hadn't moved. It was parked in his driveway all night. He showed me the map on his phone. It was a dead straight path across the county, through fields and woods, even over a river, as if the car had flown. No turns, no roads. The trip ended in a patch of farmland way north of us, then popped back to his driveway. The mileage counter was at 0, no gas missing. His security camera showed his car sitting still the whole time. I asked if someone could have cloned his tracker or hacked it. He shook his head, saying the tracker uses multiple systems and would have flagged a clone. Plus, his dash cam didn't show any movement either. He'd woken at 3:30 a.m., feeling disoriented, and checked outside. Everything was normal. I didn't know what to say. We stood there at his kitchen table, the GPS app open, both of us staring at that straight line on the screen. He zoomed in. It crossed highways, lakes, private property. There was no road following that route. That evening, I went over again because I couldn't stop thinking about it. We stood in his backyard. The woods looked normal, but I noticed a faint, sharp smell in the air, like ozone after a lightning strike. Jeff said he'd smelled it too when he woke up. Then I saw something odd. In the dirt behind his shed, a circle maybe 6 feet wide where the grass was flattened. Not burned, not dug up, just pressed flat in a spiral pattern. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking. Jeff said it hadn't been there yesterday. We both crouched, running our hands over it. The blades of grass lay perfectly aligned, radiating outward. No footprints, no tire tracks. It didn't match any tool or mower pattern. We were quiet for a long time. Later that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about the silence in the woods, how even insects had stopped. Around 1 a.m., I got up and went to the window. Jeff's house was dark. The circle behind his shed was just a darker spot in the moonlight. Then I noticed something odd on my own phone. My GPS history showed a movement starting at 1:04 a.m., a short, straight path about half a mile into the woods, then back. But I hadn't gone anywhere. I was in bed. My car was in the driveway. I checked outside. Nothing. No lights, no sounds, just mist drifting between the trees. I shut the curtains and sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. I thought about waking Jeff, but decided against it. I turned my phone off completely. In the morning, the GPS log on my phone was gone. The entry had vanished. It just showed normal activity, home all night. I asked Jeff if anything had happened to him. He said he hadn't slept at all. He'd sat in a chair by the window, waiting, but nothing came. Over the next few days, the circle in his yard faded. The grass slowly stood back up. The ozone smell disappeared. Jeff tried contacting the company that makes his tracker. They said they'd never seen a log like his. Perfectly straight, no speed variation, no road data. They asked for a copy of the log, but when he went to send it, it had reset itself. He grew quieter after that. He still lives there, but we don't talk about it much anymore. Every so often, I'll see him standing in his yard at night, staring up at the sky, and once in a while, very late, I'll wake up to that same silence, like the air has been emptied out. The woods go still, the stars feel wrong somehow, shifted. I stay in bed and don't look at my phone. I was walking home from my shift at the marina that night around 11:30, and the fog had rolled in off the bay thicker than I'd seen in a while. It wasn't that heavy, you couldn't see your hands in front of your face, but it dulled the lights along the pier, made the water look like liquid gray glass. I like walking that stretch anyway. Quiet, empty, the occasional gull calling. I needed to clear my head after dealing with a boat that wouldn't start, and a customer who swore he'd already paid me 3 times. I had my headphones in, low music, and my hands in my jacket pockets. The pier boards creaked under my boots. I noticed it first with the water. It started moving like something had disturbed it, but there was no wind, no splash, nothing visible. Just concentric ripples, neat and even, spreading outward in perfect circles. At first, I thought maybe a fish or a seal, but the circles weren't random. They weren't bouncing off each other or fading. They were aligning toward the horizon, pointing straight out toward where the bay opens into the river. I stopped walking and took out one earbud, listening. The fog made everything quieter. No boats, no motors, no gulls. Just the soft slap of water against the pier supports and that strange pattern in the bay. Then I noticed a faint light above the water, hovering maybe 20 feet over the surface. It wasn't bright, more like a muted glow, bluish-white. My first thought was someone with a lantern on a small boat, but I didn't see a boat, and the light didn't move like a person holding something. It just stayed there, still, almost weightless, as if it was floating in midair. I squinted. It felt like the light was aware of me, though that makes no sense. I shook my head. Fog. Tired. Imagination. But the water continued to ripple toward it, the concentric rings spreading out in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost calculated. I reached the end of the pier. Beyond it, the bay stretches wide and shallow toward the horizon. The light was faint now, almost merging with the fog, but I could still see it. And then, suddenly, it blinked out. Just vanished. Not moving away, not fading. Nothing. Gone. I swore under my breath. For a moment, I considered running, calling someone, but the pier was empty and my phone was in my pocket. I stood there staring at the water. The ripples stopped a few seconds later, like someone had hit a pause button. The surface went flat, unnaturally still. I took a slow step back, my boots making noise on the boards. That's when I saw the first ripple that didn't make sense. A small circle near the base of the pier, expanding outward, perfectly round. It didn't come from the water's edge or anything in it, just appeared, and as it grew, other circles popped up at irregular intervals, all moving toward where the light had been. My pulse started to race. I kept looking toward the horizon, expecting something, anything to appear. But nothing. The fog and the darkness swallowed everything. I stayed at the end of the pier for a long time, watching the water, trying to rationalize. Maybe a current, maybe the wind I hadn't felt. But the circles weren't random. They moved in straight lines, like someone was drawing them from the horizon outward. My fingers tingled, and I realized I was gripping the edge of the railing too hard. Eventually, I started walking back slowly. My boots felt heavier with every step. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to my jacket. I looked down at the water beneath the pier. The concentric ripples were gone, the surface perfectly smooth, almost reflective. Halfway back, I thought I saw something move at the edge of my vision. A shadow in the fog. I stopped, listening. Nothing. Just my breath and the soft slap of water against the pier supports. I shook my head again, muttering, "Get a grip, Liam." When I got to the parking lot, my car was exactly where I'd left it. I got in, locked the doors, and sat for a few minutes. The radio was off, my phone still in my pocket. I thought about turning it on, calling someone, but I didn't. Who would I call? There was no boat, no drone, no plane, no person. Just the pier, the water, and whatever I'd seen. Driving home, I couldn't shake the image of the light hovering over the concentric circles. And for the rest of that night, my mind kept racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the water rippling toward nothing, lines converging on empty space. I got home around midnight. My apartment smelled faintly of salt and fog. I checked the bay from my balcony. Nothing. Just the usual lights from the distant docks, the river glinting in the fog. The next morning, I told a coworker about it over coffee. He joked it was bioluminescent plankton or a trick of the fog. I wanted to believe him, but I can't. The pattern, the light, the way the water moved like it was responding to something above it that wasn't natural. I checked online for unusual phenomena, lights, currents, anything that could explain it. Nothing fit. I went back to the pier a few nights later. The fog rolled in, the water lapped against the pilings, normal this time. No concentric ripples, no light, just ordinary night. I've walked that pier many times since, Sometimes late at night, I see little anomalies, a flicker in the fog, a ripple that stops too quickly, a shadow that isn't mine. But nothing like that first night. That one hovering light. Those deliberate circles. I still think about it, and I'll probably keep thinking about it. The world feels bigger, stranger. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the water is perfectly still, I can almost picture it again. The ripples spreading toward the horizon, converging on a point I can't reach, and that faint, impossible light just hanging there before disappearing. I was up in northern Maine that night near Moosehead Lake. I'd driven out there after work because the forecast said there would be no clouds, no moon, and almost no wind. It was mid-October, cold enough for my breath to fog, but not so cold I couldn't stand outside for an hour or two. I'd been trying to improve at night sky photography, and there's almost no light pollution out there. I parked off a dirt road near an old logging trail and carried my tripod and camera up a small rise to a clearing. There's a spot where the trees open up just enough to see the Milky Way clearly. I'd been there twice before. Nobody around, no cabins with lights, just trees and water in the sky. I set up my tripod, took a few test shots, adjusted the ISO, and started shooting long exposures. The sky was bright with stars, Orion low in the east, Cassiopeia above me. I had my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust. Every so often I could hear something small moving in the woods, probably squirrels or a deer. Nothing unusual. About 20 minutes in, I noticed a point of light near the Big Dipper moving slowly. My first thought was a plane, but it wasn't blinking or leaving a trail. Just a steady white light, faint but distinct, moving in a straight line against the constellations. I raised my camera to line it up. It wasn't moving fast, slower than a satellite usually does, but faster than a star would seem to. I pressed the shutter for a long exposure, maybe 10 seconds. When I looked at the photo on the screen, the light wasn't there, just stars. I thought maybe it was too faint for the sensor, so I cranked up the ISO, refocused, and tried again. By the time I looked back up at the sky, it was gone. At first, I assumed I'd lost it, but then I realized something was off about the area of sky where it had been. The stars looked slightly wrong, like a smudge or ripple, almost like heat waves rising off asphalt. It was subtle, but enough that I had to blink a few times. The rest of the sky was crisp, but that patch looked like it was shifting very slightly. I stared at it for maybe a minute, thinking it was my eyes. Then I lifted my camera again and took another long exposure. When I checked the shot, the stars in that area were slightly distorted, bent inward, like someone had tugged them closer together. I hadn't seen anything like that in my photos before. I lowered the camera and just watched. The smudged patch didn't move much at first, but then it started drifting slowly toward the tree line to the north. The stars behind it shifted as if seen through water. I couldn't make out any shape, just distortion. At that point, I felt an odd pressure in my ears, like when you're driving up a mountain. Not painful, just noticeable. The woods around me went very quiet. No insects, no rustling. Even the distant sound of water lapping on the lake was gone. I stood completely still, feeling my heartbeat in my hands. The warped area moved lower, maybe a few degrees every few seconds. It wasn't glowing or making noise, just distorting the stars behind it. I thought about calling out, but to who? There was nobody for miles. I backed up to my tripod, trying to keep my eyes on it while fumbling with my phone to record video. When I looked at the screen, it showed nothing but normal stars. I switched back to the naked eye, and it was still there, shifting lower, slowly. Then, without any sound or flash, it just stopped. For a few seconds, the stars in that spot shimmered like they were underwater. Then they snapped back to normal, crisp, unmoving, perfectly ordinary. The pressure in my ears released at the same time, and the night sounds came back. Crickets, a faint breeze, the world like it had been before. I stayed there another 20 minutes, taking more photos, scanning the sky. Nothing else appeared. My photos showed nothing unusual except that one exposure with the bent stars. Everything else was sharp. When I finally packed up and walked back to my car, I noticed my footsteps sounded loud against the pine needles. The air felt heavier, like before a storm, even though the forecast was clear. I kept glancing up, half expecting to see that ripple again. Driving back to town, the woods pressed close to the road. No traffic. My headlights caught a few deer on the shoulder, but otherwise it was empty. My ears still felt sensitive, like after being in a plane. At home, I loaded the photos onto my laptop. Frame after frame of the sky, stars, constellations, nothing weird, except that one. In it, the stars in a circular area about the size of my hand, at arm's length, bent inward like they were being pulled. Not blurred by motion, just off. I didn't edit it or share it. It sat on my hard drive for weeks. I've gone out to shoot stars since then, even at the same spot, and I haven't seen anything like it again. Same camera, same settings. Sometimes I catch myself staring at that part of the sky even when I'm not photographing, especially on cold, clear nights. It's never happened again, but every time I look, I half expect that quiet ripple to start moving across the constellations like it did that night by the lake. I woke up to the smell of damp pine and cold air, the kind that makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter even though you'd zipped it up all the way. My alarm had gone off at 5 a.m., but something made me open my eyes before it. At first, I thought I'd just rolled over in my sleep, but then I noticed the zipper on the tent flap. It wasn't fully closed. Not by much, just a finger-width gap at the top. I never leave it like that. I'm careful about bears and wind. And I was sure I'd zipped it all the way last night. I froze for a second, listening. Nothing. Just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird starting its morning calls. My backpack, my boots, the food bag, all exactly where I'd left them. Everything inside the tent was untouched. I took a slow breath and unzipped the flap the rest of the way. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought a deer or maybe a raccoon had wandered close, but then I realized what was wrong. The footprints weren't random. They all pointed inward toward the center of my campsite where I'd slept. Some were small, some larger, but all of them led the same direction. They circled the tent, going around it, coming closer in places, and then fading off a few feet away. There were no prints leading outward from the circle, only inward. I stepped out of the tent, boots crunching on the frosted grass. The morning fog clung to the lower slopes of the mountains, softening the light from the rising sun. Everything looked normal, quiet. I scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing. No deer, no hikers, nothing that could have made prints that precise. I walked the perimeter of the tent slowly, my eyes tracing each track. I couldn't find a logical pattern to the spacing. Some prints were close together, others farther apart, but the direction never wavered. Every single one pointed at the tent. My mind started running through possibilities. Someone could have been here in the night, maybe a prankster, but the nearest trail was miles away, and I hadn't seen another camper anywhere nearby. My friends weren't supposed to be arriving until the next day, and if someone had been sneaking around my tent, why leave no footprints leading away? I tried to remember my own movements from the night. I didn't remember getting up at all. No nightmares, no half-waking wanderings, and my flashlight, which I keep under my pillow, was still there. I checked my pack, everything intact. My food bag was still zipped and hung from the tree like I left it. I crouched and examined the prints again. Some of the smaller ones had an almost human-like shape, but too thin, almost elongated. Others were broader, rounder, more like a boot. None matched any of my own shoes or the boots I had in my car. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. I debated packing up and leaving, but the fog was thick, the trails muddy. I decided to sit back on the log I'd left by the fire pit, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My coffee thermos was empty from last night, and I absent-mindedly opened it, expecting just water. It was still empty, as it should be, but the metal felt strangely cold in my hands. The sun rose higher, burning a little through the fog, and the forest came alive. Birds started chirping, squirrels chattered, and somewhere a stream gurgled. Everything looked normal. Normal enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the footprints, that maybe the frost had created odd impressions in the dirt. Almost. I packed slowly, my mind wandering back to the tracks. The circle, it wasn't perfect, but the way it curved, the spacing, the inward focus, it didn't seem random, like someone or something had been studying me while I slept, moving in a calculated way. I double-checked the tent before taking it down. Nothing else was missing. Everything from last night was exactly as I'd left it. my pack, my boots, even the little notebook I keep in the side pocket. The thought of someone or something walking around me while I slept, watching, without leaving any other trace, it made my stomach tighten. As I started down the trail toward my car, the fog slowly lifting, I kept glancing back over my shoulder. Every time I thought I saw movement, it vanished into the mist. The mountains were quiet, peaceful, but I could feel it in the air. That same tension from the night, the sense of being observed. I drove out of the parking area without seeing anyone on the trail, and by the time I hit the highway, the sun was fully out, burning off the fog. I told myself it was probably nothing, an animal, a trick of the frost and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those tracks circling my tent, the way they all led inward like a geometric pattern pointing at where I'd slept. Later that week, I told a friend about it over a call. He joked about mountain spirits or my imagination. I laughed along, but the memory of that circle stayed with me. The way the prints seemed deliberate, the way the night had felt heavier near the tent, almost patient. I went back to the same campsite months later with my friends. Everything was normal. No mysterious footprints, no strange air, no sense of being watched. But the memory lingered, especially when I camp alone. I keep my flashlight close, my tent zipped, and I check the ground around me. Sometimes at night, I imagine the footprints forming in the frost, circling the tent again, moving inward silently while I sleep. And though I can't explain it, I feel like something out there, maybe just a trick of nature, maybe something else, knows I'm here before I even wake up. I left work later than usual that night. The fog had rolled in heavy over the hills outside Ashland, the kind that makes the world feel smaller and louder at the same time. My sedan's headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead, and the wipers weren't much help, just smearing the mist across the windshield. I'd driven this road 100 times, mostly in daylight, but in that fog, it felt unfamiliar, like I was seeing it for the first time. I was halfway down a long stretch of twisting asphalt, trees crowding both sides of the road, when I first noticed something moving in the corner of my eyes. At first, I thought it was a branch blown by the wind, but then it moved again, low, fast, and almost deliberately along the tops of the trees, skimming above them like it was floating. It caught my headlights for a second, enough that I saw it clearly. Small, dark, vaguely oval-shaped. No wings, no glow, nothing I could identify. My first thought was some kind of bird, but birds don't move that fast, not at that altitude, and certainly not in that fog without making a sound. I slammed on the brakes reflexively, my heart jumping. My tires hissed across the wet asphalt. The thing wasn't more than 50 feet ahead. I slowed to a crawl, trying to keep my headlights trained on it, but when I got closer, it vanished. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. No rustling leaves, no branches knocked over, no shadow in the fog. I checked my mirrors and even shone my high beams into the trees, but the forest looked untouched. I blinked and for a moment thought I'd imagined it, but my stomach was still tight and my hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept driving slowly, eyes darting everywhere. The fog seemed to thicken around me, making the world quieter. Even the usual hum of the tires on wet asphalt felt muted, like the fog was swallowing sound. A few minutes later, I saw it again, the same shape, moving the same way along the treetops, but this time it was slightly closer. I thought I'd get a better look if I slowed down more, but as I did, it shot straight up for a second, then disappeared again. There was no trail, no debris, no sound. Just gone. I pulled over at a small turnout just past a bend. The fog wrapped the world in gray, so thick that my taillights barely showed up from the road. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the wheel, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a drone, I thought. People fly drones around here sometimes, usually near the reservoir, but the speed and silence didn't match any drone I'd ever seen, and no one was around, at least not that I could tell. The oddest part was the way it moved. Not straight, not random like an animal. It darted side to side in a way that felt purposeful, like it was avoiding me, or maybe testing me. I didn't want to believe that I was being watched, but the thought had settled in my chest like a rock. I decided to keep driving, slow and careful, the whole way home. Every curve I rounded, I half expected to see it again, following the tree line, skimming over the fog. For the next 10 minutes, everything stayed quiet, nothing moving except the occasional branch sliding in the wind. My radio static felt louder than it should have, and I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting a dark shape to appear behind me. When I got closer to town, the fog thinned. Streetlights began to pierce through the mist, and the world seemed normal again. My pulse slowly returned to something close to normal, though I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had been tracking me for the short stretch of road through the hills. I tried to rationalize it as a bird, a drone, maybe even a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but every detail, the shape, the silence, the way it vanished, didn't fit any of those explanations. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the night had mostly cleared. My neighborhood smelled like wet asphalt and pine. I sat in my car for a long minute, gripping the wheel, staring at the darkened tree line across the street. Nothing moved. Nothing had moved the entire way home since the fog lifted. I tried to tell myself it was just one of those weird things that happen when you're tired, driving through a storm with fog swallowing your senses. I told my roommate about it the next morning. He laughed, joking about me seeing flying raccoons or fog spirits. I laughed too, but I avoided looking at the hills outside town all day, and when I did, I imagined that shape gliding silently above the treetops. Later that week, I drove the same route in daylight. Everything looked normal, nothing in the trees, no sign of disturbance, no way to even guess where the shape had been. I drove slowly anyway, scanning, trying to reconcile what I saw with reality. But there was nothing. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the fog and that dark shape cutting along the treetops, appearing and vanishing without a trace. The memory wasn't like a dream. It was too precise, too vivid, as if I could reach out and touch it. I found myself avoiding that stretch of road, taking longer detours, even in the daylight. I've driven it a few times since, and the fog hasn't returned like it did that night. No dark shapes, no skimming objects, just normal hills, normal trees, normal road. But every time I pass that stretch, especially when the weather starts turning misty or rainy, I keep my eyes on the tree line, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw isn't gone, just waiting for the right conditions to appear again. I don't know what it was. Could have been a bird, a drone, a trick of the fog, but I know what I saw, and I know how it moved, and I know it vanished in a way nothing natural should. And for some reason, that feels like the most unsettling part. It didn't leave a trace, didn't make a sound, and didn't belong to the world I know. I woke up a little after 2 in the morning because my apartment was unusually quiet. Normally, I hear the hum of the fridge from the kitchen or the occasional car on the street below. That night, it felt like everything had stopped. I lay there for a while, staring up at the ceiling, trying to figure out why I'd woken up. That's when I noticed it. There was a shadow moving across the ceiling, slow, rounded, like the top of a balloon rolling through water. It wasn't sharp like the shadows cast by streetlights or passing cars, and it didn't have an edge that matched anything in my room. It was just drifting, almost imperceptibly, from one corner to the other. I blinked a few times and sat up. My first thought was that maybe the neighbor's TV or a passing truck outside was throwing some weird reflection. But the blinds were shut, and my room was darker than usual. I reached over to my nightstand and grabbed the small flashlight I keep there for power outages. The second the beam of light hit the ceiling, the shadow vanished. No trace of it. The ceiling looked totally normal, but that wasn't what unsettled me the most. When I turned the flashlight toward the rest of the room, every reflective surface, the framed photo on my dresser, the face of my alarm clock, even the black screen of my TV, had a faint glow in it. Not a reflection of my light, not the beam itself. It was like a soft, pale haze glowing inside each surface, coming from nowhere. I turned the flashlight off and on again. Same thing. The glow didn't get brighter or dimmer with the beam. It was independent, like it was embedded in the glass or the plastic itself. I got out of bed slowly, my feet cold on the hardwood. I told myself it had to be my eyes adjusting or some weird optical thing from just waking up. I walked over to the mirror on the back of my closet door. Up close, the glow looked like a thin mist on the glass, but when I reached out to touch it, My fingers met only smooth, cold surface. Then, as I stood there, the shadow reappeared on the ceiling. I saw it in the corner of my eye first, a slow curve sliding from one edge of the room to the other. I turned quickly, and sure enough, there it was again. No obvious shape, no arms or legs, just a rounded, shifting patch of darkness. I flicked the flashlight back on. Gone. And again, the glow in the mirror seemed stronger, like it was faintly pulsing. My apartment is small, living room and kitchen combined. A single bedroom, bathroom off the hall. I decided to check the other rooms just to calm myself down. In the kitchen, the microwave display, the coffee maker's chrome panel, even the little window above the sink all had that same faint glow. Not bright enough to light the room, but unmistakable. I stood there gripping the flashlight, my mouth dry. I tried switching on the kitchen light. The glow stayed. It wasn't a reflection of anything in the room. The bulbs were warm yellow. The glow was cool and pale. Then I heard something, a soft sound like air moving where it shouldn't. I turned toward the living room. Nothing. Just my couch and the stack of mail on the table. But the glow in the TV screen looked stronger now, almost like it was showing a cloudy image of a light far behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I thought about calling someone. My sister, maybe. But what would I even say? There's a weird glow in my furniture? I didn't even believe myself. I went back to the bedroom. The shadow wasn't on the ceiling anymore. The glow in the photo frame by my bed, a picture of me and my friend Jenna at the lake, was so faint it was almost gone. I exhaled, sat back down, and tried to steady my hands. Then, in the quiet, I noticed something subtle. The glow wasn't in every reflective surface, only the ones facing a certain direction. When I moved the photo frame slightly, the glow shifted and disappeared. Same with my alarm clock. Like whatever was causing it was positioned somewhere behind me, out of sight. I turned slowly, heart pounding. Nothing there, just the dark corner by the closet. I pointed the flashlight straight at it. The beam hit the wall, bright and solid, no glow, no shadow. But the second I turned it off, the ceiling above me rippled with that same rounded darkness, moving now a little faster, as if it had noticed me noticing it. I forced myself to breathe evenly. This wasn't normal, but it also didn't feel like a threat exactly. More like something just present, watching, testing. I decided to leave the apartment for a while. It was nearly 3 a.m., but I didn't care. I grabbed my hoodie, my keys, and shoved my phone in my pocket. On my way to the door, I glanced back once more. The glow in the TV screen was gone. The ceiling was just a ceiling. Out in the hallway, the building felt normal again. Fluorescent lights, faint hum of the elevator, the smell of someone's late-night cooking. No glow, no shadows. I stood there a second, listening. I walked down the stairs instead of using the elevator and stepped outside. The street was empty. A light drizzle had started, dampening the pavement. I stood under the awning for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at nothing, waiting for the adrenaline to fade. When I finally went back upstairs, everything in my apartment was normal. No glow in the mirror, no shadow on the ceiling. It was like it had never happened. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with the lights on, scrolling my phone, but not really reading anything. Every now and then, I'd glance at the TV screen to see if the glow came back. It didn't. Over the next week, little things happened. Nothing dramatic. The photo frame on my dresser fell over one afternoon when no window was open. My bathroom mirror fogged up, even though I hadn't used the shower. Once, as I walked into the living room at night, I thought I saw a faint ripple on the ceiling, but it stopped when I looked directly at it. I started keeping a lamp on at night, low and warm. Haven't seen the glow since. But sometimes, when the room is dark just before dawn, I wake up and stare at the ceiling, waiting for that rounded shadow to drift by again. So far it hasn't, but every reflective surface I pass, store windows, dark car windows on the street, feels like it's holding something faint just beneath, like a glow that fades before I can really see it. I left the diner later than usual that night, around 11:15. The place had emptied out almost completely, just me, the cook wiping down the grill, and a couple of regulars nursing their last cups of coffee. It had rained earlier, and the streets were still damp, reflecting the dull orange of the streetlights. I pulled my hoodie tighter and started walking home. the rhythm of my sneakers on the wet pavement the only real sound besides distant traffic. The neighborhood was quiet, which I liked. I'd been doing this walk for years, a straight 10-minute route through side streets and alleys, and I knew every crack and puddle along the way. It was the kind of night that usually made you feel insulated, protected by the familiarity of everything around you. But then something strange started. The first streetlight I passed flickered once, just a quick dip in brightness, like it was responding to some unseen pulse. I thought maybe it was a bulb on the way out. Then the next one, a few dozen feet further down, did the exact same thing. A flicker. Just once. And the one after that, same thing. I stopped mid-step, pulled out my phone, and checked the battery. It was fine. No other lights in the street were on or off in the same pattern. I walked a few more steps, slower this time, and noticed it again. Each streetlight blinked in sync with the last, perfectly timed. It wasn't a gradual, failing bulb or anything like that. Just one flash per lamp, in a sequence as if something were moving ahead of me through the street. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was coincidence, some strange electrical thing with the city grid, but there was a prickly feeling crawling along my neck. I glanced over my shoulder. Empty street. No cars, no people. I kept walking, even though the rhythm of the flickering made it feel like the street itself was breathing with me. Then I got to the alley at the end of Birch Street. Usually it's just a dark cut between two apartment buildings, a place I've passed hundreds of times. But tonight, there was a pale glow hovering a few feet off the ground near the back fence. It was soft, not bright enough to illuminate the alley, more like a lantern submerged in fog. I froze, my stomach knotting. The light seemed suspended, almost deliberate, and it had this faint, pulsing quality, like it was breathing along with me. My first instinct was to pull my phone out and shine a flashlight at it. The instant the beam hit the alley, the glow vanished, like someone switched it off. I lowered the phone slowly, eyes straining to see in the darkness. Nothing. Just wet asphalt, garbage bins, and the faint scent of rain on concrete. I shook my head and muttered to myself, "Get it together, Dan." My pace picked up a bit, but my brain kept replaying the lights, both the street lamps and the disappearing glow. A few blocks later, I noticed another odd thing. My neighbor's porch light was on, even though I was sure she'd gone to bed. Usually, it turns off automatically around 10. I slowed, peering toward the window. No movement inside, just the lamp burning steadily. When I looked back at the street I just passed, another flicker ran along the streetlights in perfect sequence again, like some silent signal moving down the block. I started thinking in more practical terms, trying to ground myself. Electrical anomaly, nothing more. My rational mind kept running lists, power surge, streetlight maintenance, maybe even reflections from some distant neon sign. But none of it fit perfectly. By the time I got to the main avenue, I was breathing a little heavier, more from unease than from the walk. The streetlights on the larger road didn't flicker, just the side streets. And every time I turned down a side road or an alley, the same thing, a single flicker per lamp in order like I was walking into some invisible pattern. Then there was the sound, or maybe not a sound exactly. The air seemed to shift, almost like static, but not really. My hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and Jasper, my neighbor's cat, who often followed me home, would normally dart ahead or behind, but he'd vanished a block back, leaving the street empty. I got to my own street eventually, and the lights there were normal. No flickers, no rhythm, nothing. I breathed a little easier, though my heart was still racing. I unlocked my door, double-checked that all the lights inside worked, and leaned against the frame, just catching my breath. Later that night, I went back to the alley in my mind. I tried to picture it exactly, the hovering glow, the way it vanished as soon as the phone beam touched it. No branches, no reflective surfaces that could have caused a trick. Nothing that made sense. I even considered calling the city to ask about electrical anomalies, but who would believe a story like that? For a couple of nights after, I noticed odd things. Shadows that seemed just a bit too still, corners of my vision that flickered with movement but disappeared when I looked directly. Once, the streetlight outside my window flickered in the same single pulse pattern I'd seen before. No sequence, just the one light. My rational side tried to explain it. Faulty bulb, optical illusion, exhaustion. But another part of me couldn't shake the memory of the alley, the hovering pale glow, the way it seemed to vanish when confronted. I started changing my route home, cutting across the main avenue instead of side streets just to avoid the alley. That helped a little. But sometimes late at night, I catch a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a pale glow hovering at the edge of some alley I pass, and I feel that same prickling unease. It's been weeks since that walk. Nothing else has approached me directly. No figures, no sounds, no repeating light sequences. Just memories of that single night and the strange feeling of something aware, something watching, just beyond the streetlights. I don't know what it was, or if it even comes back, but I keep my phone in my hand now when I walk, just in case. And sometimes when the streetlight flickers once and the world feels still, I wonder if it's out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to blink back on. It was late March, one of those damp evenings where the air feels heavy, but it's not quite raining. I live just outside of Auburn, Maine, on a back road lined with patchy woods and a couple of empty fields. I'd gone out around 9 with my dog, Jasper, to give him one last walk before bed. He's a big shepherd mix, normally alert but easygoing. The sky had been overcast earlier, but by then the clouds had started breaking up, leaving patches of stars. There were no planes overhead, no wind, just the occasional car passing far off on the main road. The only light came from my porch behind us and a weak glow from a street lamp down by the bend. Everything else was dark. We walked down to the edge of my property where the field begins. Jasper was sniffing around like usual. Then, about halfway across the grass, he stopped. Just froze, ears up, nose tilted toward the sky. At first I thought he'd heard an owl or maybe seen a deer, but then he let out this low growl. Not his "there's a squirrel" bark, but the kind of sound he makes when someone unfamiliar is too close to the house. I turned in the direction he was looking, just up into the open sky, and saw nothing. Stars, some wispy clouds, that's it. He started barking then, short, sharp bursts, still staring at the same spot. The hair along his shoulders was standing up. I tilted my head back, trying to follow his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, and I was about to pull him back toward the house, but then I caught it. High up, where the stars were faint, there was a formation of lights. They weren't bright, more like dim yellow-white dots, but there were several of them, maybe 6 or 7, perfectly spaced, forming what looked like a wide V or chevron shape. They were completely still. No blinking, no movement, no sound, just hanging there. I squinted, thinking maybe it was a flock of planes or helicopters, but there were no red or green navigation lights, no rotor noise, nothing. Jasper's barking echoed off the trees, but the sky itself was silent. I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, but the screen glare ruined my night vision. By the time my eyes adjusted again, the lights were still there, but seemed a little dimmer. Not fading out exactly, more like someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch. The weirdest part was how motionless they were. Even satellites or planes have a glide, a sense of movement. These just hovered. I realized my own breathing had gone shallow. The air felt heavier than before, like when a storm is about to break, but the sky was clear around them. Jasper had stopped barking and was now whining, tail down but still staring up. His ears flicked like he was hearing something I couldn't. I strained to listen but heard only the distant hum of the street lamp transformer and the blood in my own ears. Then, all at once, the lights blinked out. No gradual fading that time, just gone. 1 second they were there, the next the sky was empty, only stars. Jasper immediately whipped his head around, scanning the tree line, then back up again. I waited, expecting them to reappear somewhere else, but nothing. Just the same quiet field and patches of stars. We stood there for another minute, me gripping the leash tight, Jasper's whole body tense. I slowly backed us toward the porch, keeping my eyes on the spot where the lights had been. My heart was thudding in my chest. Inside the house, I shut the door and all the windows. Jasper paced by the back door for a while, whining. I went to the kitchen window, turned off the lights so I could see out better, and stared at the sky. It looked normal. After a while, I tried to calm myself by thinking it was probably planes lined up weirdly or something like drones, but drones don't sit perfectly still that high up without a sound, and I'd never seen them just blink out like that. Around 10, Jasper finally lay down by the couch, but kept his head up, ears toward the window. I stayed up another hour, going from window to window, looking for anything. The sky stayed empty. When I went back out the next morning to get the mail, the field looked the same. Quiet, damp, nothing unusual. No tire tracks, no broken branches. Jasper sniffed around but seemed back to normal. I kept thinking about how those lights didn't move, not even a flicker until the end, and how Jasper knew something was there before I did, staring, growling at what looked like empty sky. It's been a couple of weeks since that night. I still take him out at the same time, but I keep my phone ready now. Sometimes I catch myself glancing up at that same patch of sky, waiting for those dim yellow-white dots to snap back on like they never left. It was close to midnight when I left my friend's place outside of Champaign. I'd stayed later than I meant to, just hanging out, drinking coffee, talking about work. I wasn't drunk or tired, just wired and ready to get home. The drive back to Decatur took about an hour, most of it through flat farmland, straight roads with no streetlights, nothing but cornfields and the occasional farmhouse light in the distance. The weather was clear and warm for late spring, and the air smelled like rain that never quite came. I remember checking the clock when I pulled onto County Road 14. It was 12:21 a.m. I know that because I'd looked at it and thought, if I don't mess around, I'll be home by 1. That stretch of road is one I've driven dozens of times, and I usually like it. Quiet, no traffic, you can just zone out with some music. That night, though, something about it felt too empty. No other cars, no wind. Even the bugs seemed to have stopped. It was just the sound of my tires and the low hum of the engine. I had my high beams on because it was pitch black. The cornfields on both sides were maybe 3 or 4 feet high then, still early in the season. They looked like dark waves when the headlights swept over them. I wasn't speeding, maybe doing 55. I'd just come around a gentle bend when my headlights hit something up ahead, a person standing dead center in the lane. They weren't walking or waving or anything, just standing there, straight-backed, facing me. I only saw them for a second or two before instinct kicked in. I slammed the brakes and jerked the wheel to the right. The car fishtailed a little, tires screeching, and I ended up halfway in the gravel shoulder. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out the radio. When I looked back, the road was empty. I mean, completely empty. No person, no animal, nothing moving. I sat there for a few seconds, hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I remember the sound of my cooling engine ticking. My headlights were still pointing across the road, lighting up the edge of a cornfield. I kept expecting someone to step out. They never did. At first, I thought maybe I'd seen a deer or a mailbox or something, but no, this was a person. I saw the shape of their head, shoulders, arms. They looked solid, standing upright, not bent like an animal. I grabbed my phone from the seat next to me. 12:43 a.m. I hadn't realized how much time had passed. I guess I'd been sitting there longer than I thought. When I finally worked up the nerve to pull back onto the road, I slowed almost to a crawl as I passed the spot where I'd seen them. That's when I noticed the mark. Right in the middle of the lane, maybe 3 feet across, was this blackened circular patch, like the asphalt had been burned. The edges were uneven, almost like melted tar. My headlights reflected off it just enough to show texture, like it had bubbled up and hardened again. I stopped next to it, put the car in park, and leaned out the window. The smell hit me immediately. That hot electrical odor, like burned wires mixed with ozone. It was faint but sharp enough that it made my eyes water. I sat there debating whether to get out and look closer, but something in me said no. Instead, I just stared at it for maybe half a minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no tire marks leading to or from it. No debris, no sign of an impact. Just that single circle, like someone had torched the road in one clean burst. The weirdest part? My car's dash lights flickered while I was looking at it. Only for a second, everything dimmed, then came back bright again. The engine didn't cut off, but the radio made this short static noise, like when you brush a plug against an outlet. That freaked me out enough to get moving again. I drove the rest of the way home faster than I should have, checking my mirrors constantly. Every pair of headlights I thought I saw turned out to be reflections. Every mailbox looked like a person until I was right up on it. When I got home, the clock on my kitchen microwave said 1:52. I don't know how. Even with how slow I'd driven after, it shouldn't have taken that long. I told myself maybe I just misread the time earlier. Maybe my phone clock was off. The next morning, I went out to the car before work. It smelled like hot metal inside, even though it had cooled overnight. The air had that same faint, sharp scent from the road. I tried to ignore it. I told a couple coworkers what happened, just the part about the person in the road. They laughed and said it was probably a drunk farmer or some idiot messing around. I wanted to agree, but there was no way. Whoever it was, if it was a person, they'd vanished in seconds. That evening, I decided to drive back out there. I don't know what I expected to find. Closure, maybe. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. The sun was setting when I turned onto County Road 14 again. The fields were quiet, the sky was clear. When I reached the spot, I slowed down and looked for the mark. It was still there, faint, but you could see the darker patch against the lighter asphalt. I pulled over and got out this time. Up close, the surface looked melted and hardened again, like someone had pressed a hot metal ring into it. When I ran my fingers over it, it was rough and uneven, almost glassy in some spots. I didn't smell anything then. No smoke, no chemical scent, just dust and corn pollen in the air. But when I looked around, I noticed something I hadn't before. All the corn stalks along the edge of the field nearest the mark were bent outward, away from the road. Not snapped, just leaning. Maybe 20 feet of them, like something had pushed through from the road into the field. I stood there for a minute, listening. There was this faint buzzing sound coming from somewhere far off, like a high-pitched hum you can barely hear. I thought maybe it was power lines, but there weren't any nearby. It just went on, steady and distant, until I realized I could feel it more than hear it, a sort of vibration in my chest. I got back in the car and drove home before it got fully dark. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to my phone lighting up on the nightstand. It wasn't ringing or buzzing. The screen was just glowing, showing the charging icon even though it wasn't plugged in. I touched it, and it went black immediately. When I tried to turn it on again, it worked fine. No missed calls, no notifications. But the time said 12:43 a.m., the same time I'd checked it on the road. I didn't sleep much after that. For a few days, I kept thinking about that circular burn mark. I even checked local news online, just in case there'd been a small fire or an accident, something to explain it. Nothing. 2 weeks later, I finally told my friend, the one I'd been visiting that night. He offered to drive out there with me. We went in daylight again. The circle was almost gone by then, faded into the pavement like an old oil stain. But when we stood in the middle of it, both our phones lost service, just that one spot. A few steps away, the bars came back. We tested it a few times, same result. He laughed it off, said it was probably interference from farm equipment or a buried cable, but I could tell he didn't really believe it either. We left after that. I haven't been back since. Every now and then, though, when I drive through open country at night, doesn't matter where, I catch myself watching the road too closely, scanning for shapes in the headlights. Sometimes I even slow down, just to make sure. I never saw that figure again, but I still know exactly where it stood. My neighbor, Pete, is one of those guys who notices everything. Retired lineman, mid-60s, spends half his evenings on the porch with a beer, just watching the neighborhood. He's harmless, a little nosy, but he's the kind of guy who'll snowblow your driveway without asking if you're running late. So when he told me there'd been a light above my house, I didn't think much of it at first. It was a Thursday afternoon in late July, one of those hot, still days where the air feels heavy. I was trimming the hedges, sweat running down my back, and Pete called over the fence. He said, "You been having trouble with your power or something?" I told him no. Then he goes, "Huh. Because every night this week, around 3, there's been a bright light sitting right over your roof. I mean, right over it." I laughed and asked if he was sure it wasn't a plane or a drone. He said no, it didn't move, didn't blink, just hung there for a couple minutes before fading out. He said it didn't shine on anything either. No shadows, no glare, just this perfect white light, like someone cut a hole in the dark. I figured he'd misjudged where it was coming from, maybe one of those new LED floodlights someone installed down the street. But he swore it was directly above my house. Right over your chimney, he said. That night, I went to bed around 11. The thought crossed my mind, but I didn't stay up. Next morning, Pete waved me down again when I was heading to work. Same thing last night, he said. 3:04 on the dot. You really didn't see it? I told him I was asleep. He just nodded, looked uneasy, said it hummed this time. I laughed that off too. But that detail stuck in my head the rest of the day. That evening, I set an alarm for 2:50 a.m. I didn't tell my girlfriend she was staying at her sister's for the week, so I had the place to myself. Around 10, I made sure all the blinds were open, turned off every light in the house, and sat on the couch scrolling my phone until I got drowsy. The alarm went off, and I dragged myself up, half asleep, and sat by the living room window facing the street. Nothing. The neighborhood was dead quiet. You could hear the hum of the power lines, the distant hum of the highway maybe 5 miles off. A light wind rustled the trees. It was one of those nights where the air feels clean and thin, just enough of a chill to make the windows fog a little at the edges. I watched the clock on my phone. 3:03. At 3:04, every power line outside started to buzz. Not a gentle hum. It was loud, deep, and even, like the sound you hear standing too close to a big transformer. My window panes rattled slightly. The overhead fan in the kitchen clicked once, like it was losing power, but the lights didn't flicker. I froze. It went on for maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped all at once. The air felt weird after, still like something had been pulled out of it. I pressed my face to the glass, scanning the sky above my roof. It was clear, not a single cloud. You could see every star, no planes, no moving lights, nothing hovering. But then I noticed the street light in front of my house was out. It had been on earlier. I remembered because it always left that dull orange glow across my driveway. Now it was just dark. A second later, the neighbor's dog started barking. Not that startled kind of bark either, this low, steady, territorial sound. Then, one by one, you could hear other dogs in the area starting up too. A chain reaction of barking, like something unseen was moving through the neighborhood. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air smelled faintly metallic. Not like rain, more like the tang of an overheated motor. The grass was damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. Pete was already outside, standing in his driveway across the street. He was wearing pajamas and slippers, holding a flashlight he hadn't turned on. He looked at me and said, "You hear that?" I told him yeah, but I didn't see anything. He pointed upward, above my house, and said, "It's gone now. You missed it again." I told him I was watching the whole time, but he just shook his head. Said he saw the light, bright as daylight, sitting right above the ridge of my roof, maybe 30 seconds before I came out. He said it blinked out the instant the buzzing stopped. We both stood there for a while, just listening to the silence between the dogs barking. After a few minutes, the street light flicked back on. Pete looked relieved and said, "Told you." Then he went back inside. I stayed out a bit longer, staring up. The stars looked strange, brighter somehow, like the sky had been wiped clean. I went back in around 3:20, locked the door, and sat in the kitchen drinking water. The house felt too quiet. My phone clock still read 3:04. I reset it and plugged it in, thinking maybe it froze. When I woke up the next morning, it was working fine. The digital clocks on the stove and microwave were both blinking 12. Power must have gone out for a few seconds while I was outside. That night, I almost didn't want to stay up again, but curiosity won. I repeated the whole thing, lights off, blinds open, sitting by the window. At 3:04, it happened again. The hum, exactly the same pitch, same duration. My hair stood on end from the vibration. The metal part of the window frame buzzed under my fingertips, but this time I noticed something new. The shadows outside shifted. Not sharply, just barely, like the light source was changing direction above me. The roof line glowed faintly as if lit from directly overhead, but the street stayed dark. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. I couldn't bring myself to look straight up. I just kept staring at the glowing edge of the shingles. Then it all cut out, the sound, the light, everything. I waited until morning to go outside. The streetlight worked fine again. But in the middle of my backyard, right where the shadow of the house would have been under that light, the grass was discolored, a pale, dry patch, about 6 feet wide, almost circular. I touched it, and it felt brittle, like it had been scorched without heat. I called Pete over later and showed him. He nodded, said that was where it had hovered the night before, almost like he expected it. I joked that maybe my Wi-Fi was attracting something. He didn't laugh. That night, nothing happened. No hum, no dogs barking. The next night, same thing. By the fourth night, I started to think it was over. But around 3 a.m., I woke up for no reason. My phone said 3:02. The hum didn't start this time. Instead, there was a flickering light coming through the blinds. Not bright, more like the shimmer from a TV in another room. It pulsed irregularly, bluish white. I got up and walked to the window, slow, my heart pounding. The sky was empty again. The light wasn't coming from above, right, but from behind the house, maybe the backyard. I slipped on shoes and went through the kitchen to the back door. When I opened it, the light stopped. Everything was silent, except the faint sound of the power lines overhead. Not humming this time, just faint static, like wind through metal. So I took one step out and froze. The air around the yard felt charged, like standing near an old TV when it's on. That static pressure against your skin. My porch light flickered once, then steadied. When I looked at the dry patch of grass again, it was gone, completely green, like it had never been there. The next morning, I asked Pete if he'd seen anything. He said no, that he'd slept through the night for the first time in a week. After that, everything went back to normal. No more hums, no more lights. But once in a while, if I'm awake around 3, I'll hear a faint vibration start up in the distance. Not loud enough to rattle anything, just a low, even tone, like the sound of electricity carried through air. It only lasts a few seconds. And every time it happens, the clocks on my stove and microwave blink 12 again. It started about 3 weeks ago, right after that big windstorm we had. A few shingles blew off my roof, and I figured that was the worst of it. Until the motion light on my back porch started going off at random times. I live in rural southern Missouri, just outside a small town called Birch Hill. My house backs up to about 4 acres of woods that slope down toward a creek. It's quiet out here. No streetlights, no close neighbors, just me and a lot of raccoons. The first night it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was around midnight, and I was half asleep watching TV when the light flashed through the kitchen window. I figured it was just an animal. They set it off all the time. Rabbits, possums, even wind-blown branches if they're close enough. But after the third night in a row, I started paying attention. It always happened between midnight and 1. The light would flick on, stay on for maybe 15 seconds, then go off again. No sounds, no movement I could see. I finally checked the camera feed. I've got a decent system, motion alerts, night vision, all that. When I scrolled back to the times the light came on, there was nothing there. Well, not nothing. It's hard to describe. The footage looked normal, except for this faint shimmer right near the center of the frame. Like heat rising off asphalt, that wavy distortion you see in the summer. Only this was at night, maybe 40 degrees outside. I figured it was a lens issue, moisture, dirt, something like that. I cleaned it the next morning. But the next night, same thing. I didn't get worried until I realized it was happening closer each time. The shimmer, whatever it was, moved from the far edge of the yard to about 10 feet from my back steps over the course of a week. At first, I thought maybe it was a spider web catching the IR light, or even smoke. But there was no web, and the air was perfectly still. Around the 6th night, I decided to wait up for it. I turned off all the lights in the house and sat in the dark living room, where I could see the backyard through the glass door. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. At 12:41, the motion light clicked on. I didn't see anything. I watched the patch of grass under the light, empty. The woods behind the fence were dark. I leaned closer, squinting through the glass, trying to catch any movement. After about 10 seconds, I noticed it. A shimmer, faint and slow, just above the ground. It wasn't a shape exactly, more like the air itself was bending. It moved in this lazy, fluid way like a heat mirage, only there was no heat. I stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. The light stayed on for maybe 15 seconds, then went dark again. When I checked the camera feed right after, it showed exactly what I saw, the faint shimmer moving toward the house. Then the light shut off and the shimmer disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked out there with my coffee to look around. Nothing seemed disturbed. The grass was wet with dew, no footprints, no matted patches. The air smelled normal, no smoke, no ozone, nothing burnt. I checked the motion sensor, thinking maybe it was faulty, but it worked fine when I tested it. By that point, it was just strange enough to make me nervous, but not enough to call anyone about. I didn't want to be the guy who tells the sheriff, hey, the air is weird behind my house, so I just kept watching. 2 nights later, the light flicked on again, this time at 12:57. I was ready, standing by the door. The shimmer was back, same spot as before, but now it looked, taller. The distortion reached almost to the height of the porch railing. I couldn't tell if it was one thing or multiple, but the air rippled like water around a stone. Then I noticed something else. The sound. It was faint, like a low hum you feel more than hear. Not loud, not mechanical, just a vibration under the quiet. My window glass trembled slightly. The light stayed on longer this time, close to 30 seconds, then clicked off, and everything went still. I checked the footage again afterward. The hum didn't register on audio, but the shimmer did. And near the very end, before the light went off, the camera glitched for exactly one frame, just one, showing a brief horizontal band of static across the middle. The next morning, I emailed the camera manufacturer's support line. They said distortion like that can happen if there's a strong electromagnetic field nearby, like a lightning strike or a motor running close to the sensor. Except there hadn't been a storm in days, and the nearest house was a quarter-mile away. By the end of that week, the light was going off multiple times per night. I stopped checking the clock. It didn't matter. Always the same shimmer, always right around the middle of the yard. I thought about turning the camera off, but I couldn't bring myself to. It felt worse not knowing. Then, one night, something changed. The light came on at 12:36. I got up, walked quietly to the door, and peeked through the blinds. The shimmer was there again, but this time it wasn't still. It moved, not like a person walking, more like it was rolling or flowing across the grass toward the fence. The light above it flickered, dimmed, then surged bright again. The hum deepened. I felt it through the floorboards. And then, for maybe 2 seconds, I swear I saw a shape inside it, an outline, just darker than the air around it. Thin, vertical, and slightly bent, like a reflection that didn't belong. The light cut out. I waited a minute before moving, then went straight to the camera feed. The recording glitched again, this time longer. 3 full frames of static. And right before the feed cleared, there was a single bright flash that filled the entire image, like a camera flash right up against the lens. The next thing I noticed was the timestamp. The event marker said 2:07 a.m., but I'd looked at the clock at 12:36, right before it happened. I checked my phone, my microwave, my wall clock. All of them said 2:07. Somehow, an hour and a half was gone. That was when I started locking the back door every night. Not just the knob, the deadbolt too. The light didn't come on again for 2 nights after that. When it finally did, it was earlier, around 11:50. I didn't get up. I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum come through the walls. Then silence. The next morning, I found something odd in the yard. Near where the shimmer had been, maybe 8 feet from the porch, the grass looked pressed down in a near-perfect circle. Not burned, not dead, just flattened, like something heavy had been there briefly. The dew had dried off that patch completely, even though it was damp everywhere else. I took a photo, but it barely showed up. Just looked like slightly darker grass. That night, I unplugged the camera. I didn't want to see it anymore. I even unscrewed the motion bulb, figuring if it wanted to turn on, it could stay off for once. Around midnight, I sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, trying to focus on anything else. Then I heard it. Not the hum this time, just a faint click, like metal flexing, under pressure. It came from the direction of the back door. When I looked, the door frame was trembling slightly, like it had been tapped from outside. I stood there holding my breath, waiting. Nothing else happened. No light, no sound. I didn't open the door. The next morning, there was a small mark on the glass panel, a smear or print of some kind, but not shaped like a hand or an animal paw, more like an irregular oval, slightly fogged from moisture and faintly outlined with dust. By the time I got home from work that day, it was gone. Since then, the light hasn't turned on again. The grass grew back over the circle, the hum stopped, everything looks normal. But sometimes, when I walk outside late at night, I can feel that same faint pressure in the air, like the space around me isn't completely still. And once or twice, when I've checked the camera app out of habit, even though it's unplugged, I'll see a notification pop up on the screen. Motion detected, backyard. It started somewhere outside of Ukiah, California, on a foggy stretch of Highway 101. I was driving back from a work trip in Eureka to Santa Rosa, where I live. It was late, close to midnight, and I'd been on the road for hours. The fog rolled in around Willits, that thick coastal kind that feels like it swallows everything. You can't see more than 20 feet ahead, and the high beams just make it worse, bouncing the light back at you. I wasn't even supposed to be driving that night. I'd planned to stay over at a cheap motel and head home in the morning, but I couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd just get a head start. I'd done that drive dozens of times. 2-lane highway, winding through forested hills, sometimes opening up into farmland or small towns. But that night, it felt different. Quieter, like the fog muted everything. Even the sound of my tires on the road seemed distant. About halfway between Willits and Laytonville, I lost the radio, just static. I thought maybe I'd hit a dead zone, so I scanned through stations. Nothing but white noise all the way across the dial. That wasn't too weird. It happens out there. But then the dashboard clock caught my eye. It jumped. I don't mean I looked away and saw it was later. I mean I watched it change. It flickered, then went from 12:14 to 12:26. Just like that. 12 minutes gone. My phone, which was plugged into the charger, still said 12:14. I checked it twice, thinking maybe I was half asleep, but the car clock stayed 12 minutes ahead. I tried to shake it off. Cars glitch sometimes. Maybe the power flickered. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The fog was so dense it looked like smoke in the headlights, and the road markings were barely visible. I slowed down to maybe 35. I didn't want to pull over. There were no lights, no other cars, just fog and trees pressing in on both sides. A few miles later, I saw a green highway sign through the haze. The reflective letters were faint, but I made out Laytonville 14. The sign looked newer than the others, clean, almost glowing. I remember that detail because it stood out. But as I passed it, something about the layout seemed wrong. The mileage was in the wrong spot, like the text was rearranged. I told myself maybe Caltrans replaced it recently. Still, it stuck in my head. Then I noticed there weren't any road reflectors on the shoulder anymore. The white posts with the little red rectangles? Gone. The center line didn't have the usual gaps either. Just a solid, faded yellow line stretching endlessly forward. I drove another few minutes and saw headlights behind me. I felt relief at first. It was the first car I'd seen in almost half an hour. But the lights didn't behave right. They stayed way back, just 2 faint white orbs in the fog, perfectly spaced. I expected them to gain on me or drop back, but they didn't. I adjusted my mirror, thinking maybe it was an optical illusion. Still there. I couldn't even tell what kind of vehicle it was. After maybe 10 minutes, I reached another sign. It should have said Laytonville 6 or something like that, but it didn't. It said Redwood Falls 9. I slowed down hard, confused. There's no place called Redwood Falls on that stretch of 101. I know the area. There's nothing between Willits and Laytonville except some rural roads and maybe a diner. I actually pulled onto the shoulder, heart racing. The fog swirled around the headlights like smoke. The car behind me slowed too, just enough that its lights dimmed in the mirror, still distant, but not stopping. I kept my foot on the brake, trying to decide if I should get out or just keep driving. The road was silent except for the faint hum of my engine. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I rolled the window down and it hit me how dead the air felt. Even the fog seemed still. I looked at my phone again. Still 12:14. No service. I remember tapping it a few times, like that would fix it. My car clock said 12:38 now. The time gap had grown. The car behind me edged closer. Slowly, I could see the glow brighten against the fog. I flicked my headlights off for a second just to see what would happen. When I did, their lights disappeared completely. Not dimmed, not receding. Gone. Like flipping a switch. I turned my headlights back on and the other car's lights came back too, in the same exact spot they'd been before. Perfectly still. That's when I decided to just keep moving. I eased back onto the road and drove faster than I should have, maybe 50 through fog so thick I couldn't see the next curve. The other lights followed. Not closer, not farther. Always the same distance. Then the fog thinned a little, just enough to see tree shapes again. I noticed the trees looked off, taller, narrower, the branches higher up. The whole forest looked foreign. I didn't recognize any of it, and I'd driven that highway 100 times. The asphalt even looked darker, smoother, like it had just been repaved. After maybe 20 more minutes, I passed a sign for Redwood Falls 3. I slowed down again, scanning for turnoffs, but there weren't any. Just the same endless blacktop and that faint light behind me. I started feeling this pressure in my ears, like when you drive up a mountain. I swallowed a few times, but it didn't help. The fog seemed to pulse with the hum of my tires, like the whole world was vibrating slightly. Then the headlights behind me blinked out. No fade, no distance, just gone. I pulled over again, adrenaline pounding. I turned off my headlights, my engine, everything. The fog glowed faintly from the dash lights, but outside it was pure black. I waited, maybe a minute, maybe 5. No sound. When I finally started the car again, the clock read 1:09. My phone said 12:18. That's when I noticed the fog was clearing. It just lifted. The trees came back into view, shorter now, familiar-looking pines. I drove forward slowly, and after a few minutes I saw another green sign, Laytonville 9. I swear it was the same stretch of road I'd started on. Same cracks in the pavement, same bend in the lane markers. I pulled over at a turnout and just sat there. Checked my phone again, full service now. Time read 12:32. I texted my wife, just something like almost home, fog's bad. When I got home around 2:30, I checked Google Maps for Redwood Falls. Nothing. No town, no landmark, nothing. The next morning, I went out to my car and noticed my dash clock still said 12 minutes ahead. I reset it manually. 2 days later, it was 12 minutes ahead again. I tried to tell my coworker about it. He's driven that route plenty, but he just shrugged and said maybe I was tired or missed an exit. But there's no alternate route, no detours that lead back to 101 like that. I looked. I haven't driven that stretch at night since. Once a few weeks later, I thought about trying to find Redwood Falls again in daylight, just to prove to myself it wasn't real. But every time I think about that fog, and that moment the radio went dead and the clock jumped, something in my chest tightens. So I haven't gone back. I pulled off the highway because my eyes were burning and my hands had gone that weird, gripless thing you get after driving too long. It was just past 2 in the morning, the kind of hour where the turnout's gravel smelled like cold dust and the whole world feels like it's waiting for you to move. There was a bench and a rusted kiosk with an old map and a single lamp that hummed more than it lit. I killed the engine, leaned back, and decided I'd nap for 20, half an hour at most. The highway behind me ran straight as a spine through the hills. You could see the red reflectors receding like a dotted line into the dark. In the trees to the right, something moved, small, quick, like a raccoon, but it didn't catch my attention. I shut the car door and the ice-cold air hit me in the face. The sky was clear, too clear, and the stars had that raw, biting sharpness you only get where there's no city glow. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, I felt like a thing had shifted under the world, a slight looseness under my feet. Before I say what I saw, there were small things that should have been stupid and that I dismissed. The radio, which had been playing a late-night talk show, went to static at the precise second the engine turned off. It stayed on a thin hiss until I jabbed the power, then snapped back like nothing had happened. My watch, an old digital one I leave clipped to the visor, flashed 2:03 for a second, and then 200 like it was correcting itself. My phone, which had been at 60% when I pulled in, slid down to 30 in 2 minutes flat. Those are the kind of details you shrug and blame on cheap electronics and long drives. But I wrote them down later because the shrug felt stupid all night. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, my knees up, blanket over my legs. I wasn't exhausted enough to sleep properly, just that foggy, in-between tired you get when the body wants to shut down and the head refuses. I watched the trees. That's when the light appeared. It wasn't in the trees, not really. It seemed to float in the space where trunks and sky met. At first it was a single pinprick, small and white, not a flashlight because there was no beam. It blinked once, faintly as if breathing, then pulsed again. A slow, deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat. The pulse made the leaf edges wash in a pale wash of light. It was maybe 100 yards in, maybe less. Distance is slippery at night. The way it pulsed made me notice my own pulse in my throat, as if the world and my body had synced for a second. It didn't move like anything I knew. Not a flare, not a headlight, not a lantern. It stayed suspended between trunks and darkness, and it pulsed, always pulsing. When it pulsed, the maple nearest to it threw off a shadow that curved in a way that said the light was three-dimensional, not a trick from a distant town. It made no sound, made no sound. The only sound was the far highway and the lamp at the kiosk humming. I could have driven away. I told myself that several times. I didn't. I rolled down the window and stuck my head out, the cold slamming my cheek. The smell of the woods was sharp, pine, wet earth, the faint oil ghost of the turnout lamps. The light pulsed again, steady and patient. I took a sip of coffee from a thermos that had gone tepid. The coffee tasted metallic for a second, and I remembered the laughter I'd had with my coworker earlier, how silly it would look if I came back and said, there was a breathing light in the trees. I smiled, small and useless, and told myself to be practical. Practical meant I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward it. I took my keys and left the car unlocked. The gravel crunched under my boots louder than I wanted. The warm breath of the engine faded behind me. The light didn't move but seemed slightly closer when I stepped off the turnout and onto the soft shoulder where the pines crowded in. The trees were close enough to touch if you leaned, and the trunks had that living smoothness you only get in old growth, moss in the creases, small mushrooms at the base. My flashlight beam was useless. The light in the trees didn't react to it the way a person's would. It pulsed in its own rhythm, independent of anything I did. When the beam crossed the trunk of a tree, the pulsing reflected like a faint halo on the bark. But the source stayed stubbornly in the gaps between branches. Once in a while, the pulse would be slightly brighter on one side, and then a second later, the other side would pick up the glow, as if whatever was making it could tilt. I walked until the gravel gave out and the underbrush made it impractical, then stopped and watched through the windshield. Sitting inside the car had the advantage of a frame. The dash was my foreground and the trees were that impossible painting in the middle distance. The light pulsed, and each pulse made the woodlands breathe a little. More odd things happened. My phone camera refused to focus on the glow. When I pointed it and tapped the screen, the camera seemed to choose to focus on the droplets on the windshield rather than the light, the little beads throwing off halos. I took multiple photos, and each came out with a gray smear where the light should have been, like the sensor had been overloaded, then decided to blank that part out. On one shot, there was a thin vertical line in the smear, almost like a scratch in the image, then gone on the next frame. The photos had timestamps that matched the car clock, except for one. The last picture I took said 2:21, but my phone still insisted it was 2:09. I stared at the numbers until my eyes watered and then closed the phone. The numbers didn't change. I tried to be rational. Maybe some hunter had a glow-in-the-dark decoy, or someone had rigged up LEDs for an art piece. The turnout's map had marked the area as private, but people walked through these trees. Runners, stray teenagers, a couple with flashlights walking their dogs sometimes. None of that felt right. A wind brushed through and the pines sighed. When the wind pushed through, the light didn't sway on a branch. It steadied, as if resisting. That resistance made my skin prickle. The deeper the silence, the louder my thoughts got. The highway had receded to a thin thread. I could hear a single moth beating itself against the glass in the lamp's light near the kiosk. Otherwise, nothing. I thought about going back to the car and sleeping. I thought about calling someone who I didn't know. I thought the rational thoughts, like, if it's dangerous, leave now, and the irrational ones, like, maybe it's just lost, whatever it is. I sat on the hood, my breath making clouds, and watched. At one point, the light pulsed faster, just a touch, an accelerando, and I felt my knees give out in a slow sigh. The air inside the car seemed to thicken. It was the kind of pressure you notice in your sinuses, like the quiet before a jet lands. My knees went weak enough that I had to grip the edge of the hood. I realized then that the pulse had set a rhythm I'd unconsciously matched. My fingers tightened and loosened to the beat. Then, impossibly mundane, another car came by on the highway, headlights sweeping the turnout for an instant. The light in the trees dimmed with the oncoming glare, and the pulse paused for the time the headlights crossed, as if timing itself to the world. When the car passed, the pulsing resumed from where it had stopped. The fact that it could pause and restart with the traffic made me think it was aware, or at least responsive to outside stimuli, and that thought did something icy down my spine. I filmed it with the dashcam next because my phone photos had gone weird. The dashcam recorded neat, grainy footage with a tiny timestamp in the corner. The one thing that feels reassuringly factual in nights like that. On playback later, the footage showed the light exactly where I'd seen it, pulsing, and the timestamp marched along like always, 2:10, 2:11, 2:12, until in the middle of a pulse, the timestamp stuttered for one frame and then jumped 5 minutes. The frame didn't cut, the image didn't skip. The only thing different was the number in the corner. I rewound until I'd memorized the jump. I checked the dashcam settings, I checked the file info. The parabola of the pulse held exactly the same between both times the numbers displayed different minutes. I shut the laptop and went to make coffee I didn't drink. By then, the fog had started to creep in low to the ground, thin fingers curling between trunks. When fog comes at night, it steals your sense of depth. Distances flatten into an endless wash. The light kept pulsing, patient as ever. And sometimes the fog caught the pulse and showed it like a pale skin across the trunks, and then the fog would swallow it whole again. When I walked back to the car, I found a faint smear across the lower windshield, like someone had dragged a finger through the glass from the outside. It wasn't wet in the way rain would make glass wet. It left a powdery streak that didn't come off with a single swipe. I wiped it with my sleeve, and a little gray dust came away and smudged on my skin. I blew on it, and the air tasted faintly of iron. I stayed until the pulse slowed and settled into longer gaps. For a long time, I sat with the engine off, hands warm in my pockets, watching the trees breathe in light and out darkness. At some point, I realized that my phone had gained signal back. I checked the time, 2:54. I checked the dashcam file again. The timestamp matched. The strange little 5-minute idiocy had resolved into straight time. Nothing had happened to the file. There was just a jump in the corner that I could show anyone, and they'd say it was a quirk of cheap hardware. Maybe it was. I drove off the turnout the way you always drive away from a place where you've been foolish, too fast for comfort, eyes on the mirrors. The light stayed behind, small and patient, pulsing in the trees until the highway took a bend and it was swallowed by darkness. In the rear view, my own headlights made a gray tunnel that eventually left only the highway and me. My hands were a little shaky when I merged. I slept in my bed that morning, and Daisy, my neighbor's dog I'd been walking earlier in the day, she who had energetic smells and a wag with a mind of its own, found her spot at my feet. I made coffee and thought about the smear on the windshield and the dashcam timestamp that had jumped, and the way the trees had resisted being moved by the wind. None of it added up to anything explainable. When I took my car in for an oil change a few days later, the mechanic pointed out a thin streak on the hood. He said it looked like sap or salt and asked if I'd driven through anything. I told him no, and he shrugged and wiped it with a rag. The rag came away gray for a second and then clean. He didn't ask further. I don't go back to that turnout. There's no reason beyond the simple, stubborn thing inside me that likes to keep a margin of sanity. I slept there and I woke and I left, and that's the way it was supposed to be. Sometimes, when I'm on long drives at night now, I find myself looking for that small pulse in the trees at the edge of my peripheral vision. expecting to see it waiting. Mostly, I don't see anything. Once or twice, I've caught a pale blink of something between trunks and told myself it was an owl, or a distant farm lantern, or the trick of a tired eye. I tell myself practical things because that's the only way to get through a morning after a night where the world behaved like it had a secret of its own. If anything else like that happens to me, if a light that breathes shows up again, or the dashcam numbers skip, or my mug tastes like metal for no reason, I'll park somewhere and wait until morning. For now, I have the smeared rag in the glove box and a dashcam file with one small, stubborn jump in the corner. That's all I have beyond the memory of a light that pulsed like a living thing inside the trees and the strange, impossible hush when it did. I stopped at the overlook because the road had been a grind and I needed to stretch my legs. I'd been driving all afternoon from Reno up into the Sierras, the sort of weekend escape that starts with a playlist, a thermos, and the idea that being alone in the mountains is somehow the reset you don't get in town. It was late October. The first real cold had set in, and there was a thin dusting of snow on the ridges. The air at the pullout tasted like metal and pine. My dashcam had been a dumb impulse buy from Amazon. Cheap, adhesive mount, 1080p, picked up because I liked the idea of having a record of the drive. I'd got it mostly, so my insurance couldn't deny me if someone hit me on a back road. It sat there on the windshield like a little black eye. I'd glanced at it a couple times while I was getting coffee out of the thermos, making sure it had power and the little red light was steady. There had been weird, small things before the thing over the ridge. First, the radio cut out for a full minute on a stretch where it never had before. Static, then dead. My phone showed a full bar and then zero, and then full again, like it had hiccuped. The cluster lights dimmed twice for maybe 2 seconds each. Not a full power loss, just a shudder where the dashboard went half dark and came back. Little stuff you chalk up to old wiring and mountain roads. I sat on the bumper and pulled my jacket tighter. The overlook looked down a valley rim where you could see the next ridge over and the highway curling off into a canyon. The sky was clear, stars starting to prick through purple dusk. There were no lights on the opposite ridge, just the pale wash of snow and dark trees. A hawk or something had been circling earlier, but it had gone. Even the normal background noise, distant traffic, a dog from a house below, was gone. It felt like the world had taken a breath and held it. I walked back to the car because I wanted to warm my hands and check the dashcam footage. I fumbled with the little button to power it on and held my phone up to it to make sure the timestamp matched my watch. It did, 8:13 p.m. I put the thermos in the cup holder and watched the screen out of some nervous habit. That's when I saw it, a static white dot just above the ridgeline, maybe 5 miles away as the crow flies, hovering. It wasn't twinkly like a star, and it wasn't streaking like a plane. It was a small, sharp point of light, steady as a nailhead. For a second, I thought it was a headlamp on a helicopter, except it didn't move, didn't dip, didn't throw a beam, just sat there like someone had planted a flashlight in the air and left it on. I watched it for a minute, and the feeling of being watched came back, that tightness behind my sternum. My hand went to my phone, and I held it out of the window to get a closer look. The camera's autofocus hunting on the dim point made it just look like a bright pixel. I sat down, and the engine idled, low and even. The hawk shadowed the ridge somewhere unseen, a motion out of the corner of my eye. A minute passed. Then the light moved, not down the ridge or across it, but sideways in a short, clean arc. It wasn't the random drift of a satellite. It was smooth, intentional. The light slid left, stopped, slid right. I say those words because they were all I could think to say out loud to fill the space. I felt like I was watching a child on a string toy, not something at altitude. When I replayed the dashcam footage later, I found out I'd been wrong about the time sequence of that first movement. But standing there, I only knew the movement as I saw it. Slow, precise, nothing like any aircraft I'd seen. I took the thermos back inside the car and hit record on my phone. The camera captured the light but looked awful, grainy, blown out pixelation where the point of light saturated the sensor. I zoomed in on the dash cam. The built-in date stamp on the corner read 2013-47. The video was smooth, as if filmed from a mount. The light sat above the ridge until 2014-10, slid left, held, slid right, and then stopped. That's exactly when a group of small things happened at once and layered over each other like notes in a chord. My phone alarm, which I hadn't set, chimed once in that tinny, half-annoyed way. The car's clock on the dash blinked 2021 for a single frame and then returned to 21 till 14. My breath caught in my throat in the way it does when someone walks into the room you thought you were alone in. The hawk cried once far below, a wet little keening. I watched the light hold. It didn't blink out. It didn't bank away. It just sat like a punctuation mark over the ridge. I drove on because my head was full of small gears clanking. I wanted to get down the mountain before the road iced, and I wanted cell service to call someone and sound normal about it. The highway wound back down, and the radio came in and out like a nervous friend. I kept stealing glances in the rearview mirror. The light stayed in roughly the same place relative to the ridge, drifting the tiniest amount like a boat on a huge, invisible current. I rolled into the first gas station town and pulled into the lot. The neon signs hummed in the dark, and I told myself I'd only be 5 minutes. I turned the car off, opened the door, and felt how cold the world had become. The breath haze in front of me looked wrong for the temperature. Too thick, moving like smoke. I told myself to stop acting like a character in a movie. Back at my laptop that night, after coffee and a cigarette on the hood, I uploaded the dash cam footage onto my phone and watched the segment over and over. The video file was fine. The motion, the arcs, the perched light, all there, even the sound of my thermos lid clicking in the background. But when I played the footage, the timestamp behaved oddly. The dash cam's embedded stamp read 2047 at the start. The light appears. At the moment, the light slides right, a motion that takes about 3 seconds. The timestamp advances not 3 seconds, but 7 minutes, jumping from 2014-16s with no visual cut. Frame by frame, there's no missing footage. The video continues playing exactly where it left off. The light still hovers, the ridge remains the ridge, my own hood ornament reflected in the lower corner. The image doesn't skip, the soundtrack doesn't skip. The only thing that changes is the stamped time in the corner, like the camera secretly decided it lived in a different minute. I watched it several times, thinking I'd misread the numbers until my eyes hurt from squinting. I slowed it down to 1 frame per second. The stamp leaped exactly 7 minutes forward in the middle of the light's tiny horizontal crawl. Then it kept going. I checked the file metadata. The file creation time matched when I'd uploaded it. The dashcam clock was set to local time. There was nothing in the properties that explained a 7-minute jump. I plugged the dashcam into another machine, swapped memory cards, tried different players. Same result, smooth footage, timestamp skip. I told a friend, Jess, who works nights in a hospital and believes in weird things only as a way to avoid being scared by them, and she asked if I'd checked the dashcam firmware. I thought I had, but I updated it anyway. No effect. I took the SD card out and looked at it under a loop. No fingerprints, nothing. It was warm when I removed it, oddly warm long after I'd been sitting with my hands in mittens in the cold. After that night, the small anomalies stayed with me like thistles. My car's clock would be a minute or two off for a day at a time. My phone would drop calls exactly when I'd be about to describe the moment I'd seen the light, and then reconnect a few minutes later with no missed call log. At work, someone would ask if I was sleeping okay, and I would tell them yes, because you always say yes. But I'd think about the stamped jump, the way that single digital number could be wrong, while the rest of the world kept humming the same tune. A few weeks later, my buddy Rob and I drove back up to the overlook at dawn because I needed to see the ridge in daylight. We parked and stood looking. The place looked ordinary, all scrub and snow and the thin strip of highway like a sewn seam down a coat. We found a small patch of pine sap on the shoulder where my thermos must have rested. There were no prints other than ours. No scorch on the brush. Nothing burned. The only odd thing was that some of the sap was grayish instead of amber. I scraped a sliver into a jar with my pocket knife. more because I couldn't think what else to do. Rob asked me why I was still circling it. I didn't have a good answer. The honest one, that a timestamp had skipped 7 minutes while the camera showed nothing missing, sounded ridiculous even to me. He shook his head and said maybe it was low battery, and then laughed like that made it all fine. I drove home that day, slower than usual, watching the horizon as if I'd missed something obvious. The light never reappeared. The dash cam continued to record, dutiful and mute, dutifully stamping minute after minute across the corner of the footage. Sometimes I watch the clip again in the dark, frame by frame, like that's where an explanation might be hiding. Sometimes I compare the phone's clock to the cars, the ovens, any clock. They mismatch sometimes, in small ways, nothing enormous, nothing you can point a finger at and say that was it. Occasionally, when I'm alone in the car at night and the world feels like a single long ribbon of black, I catch myself checking the rear view. Not for other cars, but for something else. For a dot where it shouldn't be, for a slow, perfect arc. I don't have a theory. I have an awkward humming patch of footage and a number that leaped forward 7 minutes with no cut. And I have the sense that something about the night was patient enough not to break its rhythm just because I noticed. I keep the original file backed up in 3 places. Sometimes I think I should send it to someone who studies oddities, or to a forum where people trade timestamps like currency. Other times, I think it's exactly the sort of thing that would get you labeled as the guy who saw a light once and couldn't let it go. So, I drive when I can, keep the dash cam clicked on, and I try to measure the minutes when I can. If anything else unusual shows up one day, a second camera warm in my hands, or a light that doesn't move like a plane, I'll photograph it, stamp it, and watch the numbers like they're a confession. For now, there's just that one file and the knowledge that whatever hung above that ridge, it was patient enough to let my cheap camera record it without changing the film, and clever enough to move time in a way only a tiny digital number would notice. It started with the porch light failing. I remember that because I was standing on the steps rinsing out a glass jar watching the last of the sunset fade behind the maples. It was late July and the front yard smelled like cut grass and the neighbor's barbecue. My phone said 9:13 p.m. The light over my door blinked once, twice, and then everything beyond the porch went dark in a way that felt immediate. Not a gradual dim, but a clean cigarette burn cut to night. For a second, I thought it was just my bulb. Then the house across the street went black, then the whole row. The streetlights clicked off like they'd been switched. The engine noise from the highway thinned until it was nothing. My phone's screen brightened in my hand because it was the only light for a block. I set the jar in the sink and walked to the driveway. The power outage was neighborhood-wide. Cars coasted to the curb, headlights cutting short arcs, then turning off too. Someone down the block turned on a flashlight. The beam looked small and industrious in the dark. Kids came running out of their houses, pajamas flapping, and their parents, blinking in the doorway, wore cerulean faces like people who'd been woken up by bad news. We all did the same thing after the first stunned minute. We stepped into the street. It was the most American kind of thing, I guess. Everyone out in the road in slippers, looking up and at each other. Mrs. Delgado from next door held a candle under the awning because she'd seen it in a movie once. Ethan from 3 houses down had his skateboard under one arm and his phone held like a talisman. There was no sound of sirens, no dispatchers on the scanner someone had brought out, just a gathering of voices clipped by sleep and curiosity. The odd little things piled up before anything major happened. My digital clock on the oven reset to 12:00, like the circuit had tripped. My instant coffee maker, the one with the tiny display, showed gibberish until I banged on it, and it went blank. My phone dropped from 3 bars to nothing for a few seconds, then came back with a single text from my sister that said, "Are you seeing this?" And then a string of question marks. Dogs began to bark all at once in a low, urgent way. Not the playful yips, but that deep, pointed barking that makes you look over your shoulder. A dozen dogs somewhere down the block howled once like a choir. We stood there in a loose ring, lanterns and candles and phone screens making little islands of light, and the sky above was impossibly vast. No airplane trails, no orange haze from the city. The Milky Way was a slab of milk, thick and detailed, more stars than I remembered seeing since I was a kid. It felt like we'd been handed fresh, raw night. Then it moved. At first, I thought it was a plane stuttering because there was a triangle of sky that went dark for a half second and then bright again. But then it slid, very slowly, like someone dragging a ruler across a sheet of paper. The patch of darker sky maintained a triangular outline, edges crisp against the stars, but it wasn't a shadow from a cloud. The stars were gone where it passed. They simply vanished, as if someone had peeled back a tiny piece of the heavens and put a black card in its place. People said things then. What the hell? Is that a weather balloon? And the words broke on their way out because no one could make a theory that fit what we were seeing. Ethan raised his phone and tried to film. The screen showed the triangle at first. Then when he zoomed in, it turned to a smear of gray, like the camera couldn't decide what to do with it. He swore and pointed. The band of darkness moved a hair to the left. There was no sound. No hum, no distant engine, not even the high whine of a chopper. The dogs barked, then fell silent. The quarter moon hung to the side of the triangle like an offended spectator. The shape moved with a slow, methodical grace, the tip leading, the base trailing, crossing from one side of the sky to the other in a way that made everyone's necks ache. I remember thinking about light meters and exposure and the way a camera tries to interpret a scene. A few people kept trying to photograph it. On every phone, the result was the same. If the camera exposed for the stars, the triangle was absolute black, no detail. If it exposed for the triangle, the stars around it burned out into snow. The analog cameras, the old manual on Mrs. Delgado's shelf that someone brought out with trembling hands, showed a negative like someone had scratched the emulsion. It didn't look like anything anyone had seen before. The neighborhood collectively held its breath. The triangle kept moving, and with it the patch of missing stars tracked across Orion and past the Pleiades. When it moved over the gas station's sign, the red neon flickered and held, as if it were suddenly rethinking color. The street lamps, the ones that had gone out with the rest of the grid, stayed dark. If there had been any sound at all, it might have been the soft rustle of someone shifting on grass, the sound of shoes on asphalt when someone paced and went back to looking up. At one point, as the triangle passed over the far oak and then the river beyond, the sky around it bent very slightly. Not like heat haze, there was no heat. More like the stars near the leading edge stretched a little toward the form, as if gravity was a hand tugging at pinpricks of light. I noticed it and said it out loud, and two other people echoed it at once. Then, a minute later, a humming note arrived under everything. It was faint and steady, like a tuning fork somewhere in the ground. It made the wineglass in my hand quiver. The sound didn't come from the triangle. It arrived at the same time from multiple directions, like it belonged to the whole neighborhood. When the humming started, a man on the corner, I had seen him at the mailboxes earlier. He had a name tag that said Paul, turned on his truck radio because habit, and the radio answered with a thin band of static that fell into the same pitch as the hum. He shut it off right away and laid a hand on the hood, looking as small as the rest of us. The triangle kept moving, exactly the width of 2 or 3 constellations at once, and the space it occupied was darker than anything I'd ever seen. Not a deeper black, but an absence. If I squinted, I could see the outline of it, and the edges had a sort of soft halo under close inspection, like the night had been cut, and the cut rim glowed a touch. I thought about birds. Where had they gone? The birds had abandoned the sky. The neighborhood quiet was not empty. It was thick with the sense that something had rearranged how we were supposed to measure up to the world. For how long, I don't know. My phone read different from all the wall clocks. The oven was still at 12. Someone's wristwatch had jumped ahead 5 minutes and then back. Time felt elastic in that ring of people on the street, stretched and held and maybe even measured against the triangle's slow drift. Then, it passed over the river and the air seemed to snap like a rubber band releasing. The stars popped back into place, not perfectly as if someone had to repin them in the sky, and the humming died. Dogs barked at once, relief or protest, I couldn't tell. A car down the road started up with a jerk, and headlights carved out bright rectangles. One by one, the home's lights blinked back on as the grid re-engaged. The street lamps buzzed and warmed uranium gold. The oven clock resparked, and Glenn from across the street laughed a little too loudly and said something about needing a drink. We all stood in the warm light, as if someone had turned a page for us. People drifted back toward their houses with thin, private smiles and 100 questions. Mrs. Delgado hugged herself and then walked slowly, like she'd been holding a secret and decided to keep it. Ethan replayed his shaky video and showed us the smear, and then scrolled to the next clip, where the triangle was gone and a flock of birds had returned to scatter like confetti. I walked home along the sidewalk under the now familiar porch lights and felt a ridiculous urge to check the sky again, like I'd missed a cue. The night looked like any other except brighter, as if our seeing had sharpened something in us. I unlocked the door, and something tiny and domestic waited to anchor me. The smell of coffee from the next house over, the faint clink of someone washing dishes. I put the jar on the counter and turned the light on in the kitchen, and its bulb hummed normally. Before I went to bed, I looked out the back window one more time. The house at the end of the block had a motion light that clicked when a raccoon passed through, and under the streetlight, the grass looked ordinary and flat. There was no trace of the triangle left in the sky, no missing stars, nothing on the weather app but a small note about a temporary outage due to a local grid event. My phone had about 1 bar of service. I thumbed a message to my sister that said, simply, "You saw it too, right?" She responded with a laughing emoji and then, "Yes, don't be weird." In bed, the ceiling fan hummed a comfortable, steady note that made the house sound like itself. I lay there and tried to name what I'd seen with ordinary words. Triangle, silhouette, darker than the night. I tried assembling facts into sentences and then tossed them aside because they felt like bandages on a cut that hadn't healed. The neighborhood slept the way neighborhoods always do. Windows dark, slow breathing behind curtains. But my skin felt like a ledger, ledgered with small, unaccounted for things. Morning came, and with it the small, mundane proof that the world still kept its order. The garbage truck, the mail carrier, a neighbor's dog dragging a leash. People told the story in bright, efficient bits over coffee while standing on driveways. A post popped up on the neighborhood website with 3 shaky videos and 20 comments. The power company called to say crews had found nothing wrong with lines. The mayor's office issued a curt statement about an unexplained visual anomaly and advised people not to speculate. Everyone laughed over that sentence until the laugh soured and we put our hands in our pockets. I went to work, and my coworkers asked me how my weekend was and if I'd seen the lights. I said yes, and kept the rest small, the way you do when you've watched something that fits no section of your neat life. At lunch, I stepped outside and looked up. The sky was clear and normal, a shorthand blue. I took pictures of it like a joke, like proof that clouds obey the day. They did. At night, since then, I drive a little slower through my neighborhood. I stop at the corner and look up at the same patch of sky where the triangle slid, or at least where I remembered it. Sometimes I see a plane, an honest contrail. Sometimes there's nothing at all. The stars are there, big and patient. The memory of that black triangular cut across them sits in me like a note whose melody I can't finish. I don't have a neat ending for it. I only have the streetlight glow, the dog's sudden chorus, and the way the whole neighborhood gathered out in slippers to look up and try to make sense together. I launched the drone because the light was doing that stupid, perfect thing right before sunset. The kind of soft, oily gold that makes cliffs look like they belong in a travel brochure. I'd driven up the coast alone, like I did when I needed to not think about emails and bills. The place was a little cove north of Mendocino, a stretch of rock and scrub you have to hike down to if you want it all to yourself. The wind was low, the ocean was flat enough to mirror the sky, and I set the controller on my knee and pushed the sticks. The drone was in Mavic Air 2. Nothing exotic, but good enough that the footage usually looked nicer than anything I shot with my phone. I prepped it the usual way. Prop checks, GPS lock, battery to 90%. The signal bars on the controller showed strong. I remember thinking how nice it would be to get a wide sweep of the cove, the cliffs, the foam, how small a person looked walking that shoreline. I clipped the prop guard on out of habit, even though I never used it on open water, because there's a comfort in ritual. At first, everything was normal. The drone lifted, snapped into position a little above the cliff lip, and I eased it forward along the coast. The camera feed was buttery. You could see the wet sheen on the rocks, the dark tongue of kelp drifting like a slow shadow. I dipped the drone lower to get the surf lines and a little patch of sand that looked like a pale thumbprint. The colors were insane, blues that weren't on my monitors. Then something small and stupid happened that I didn't think to write down at the time. The compass warning popped up. I'd seen it before in parking lots when a car radio was loud, a warning that vanished if you moved 10 feet. I nudged the drone sideways and the warning cleared. I shrugged and kept going. A minute later, the birds went quiet. There were always birds along that stretch, gulls looping and terns darting over the water. They'd been around since I walked down from the parking area, noisy and messy like they owned the place. But as the drone banked over the cove, they fell into a hush. I mean, full stop, wings folded, a few coasting in a wider arc, but the noise just stopped. I noticed it like you notice background music cut in a movie. You only realize how loud it was when it's gone. At the same time, the controller beeped, signal lost. It was a flat, clear warning. The screen froze on the live feed for a heartbeat. The altitude readout hung at 280 feet. And then the telemetry continued, but the image turned into a smear of static for maybe half a second. The controller tried to relink, the little icon pulsed, and then the feed popped back as if nothing had happened. That would have been fine. Drones lose signal all the time and come back. But the world felt different in that tiny slice of time. Air pressure or my imagination, I don't know. I should have brought it straight back then. Instead, I pushed it another few hundred feet out to get the whole bay in frame. The camera was sharp. The kelp looked like a dark braid. I eased a little higher to give myself more margin, watching the beach for anyone, thinking about how nice the footage would look on a slow second-day edit. That's when the screen went black again, and this time the controller gave me the return to home countdown automatically. RTH engaged, it said, and then the telemetry froze at 360:21. The controller still showed bars, and the GPS map rendered the drone's white dot out where I'd sent it. But the live image was gone. I panned the camera with the wheel and got nothing. Just a gray fuzz where the ocean should be. I thumbed the control, waved my arms like I was signaling an idiot on an airstrip. Nothing. The controller kept beeping like an insistence, but the bird didn't obey. I ran down the path toward the shoreline, controller in hand, because the automated return hadn't kicked in the way it should. The drone was out beyond the kelp line, farther than I usually pushed. As I crested the last dune, the wind hit. A small gust off the sea that made my eyes water, and I could see the surface. For a few seconds, my brain tried to explain everything. Maybe it had been a flare, a wake from a fishing boat. Then I remembered the feed had gone dark and tried to locate it with my eyes instead of the screen. Search patterns are dumb when your hands are shaking. I moved along the waterline, scanning the horizon inch by inch. The sun lowered itself like a coin, slipping into velvet. I called out the drone's name like it might answer. Nothing. I hiked back up after 20 minutes, chest aching, thinking I'd just lost a stupid little machine to the ocean. The controller recorded last telemetry at 3:16:21, and then nothing, as if the unit had stopped logging. I sat on a ragged rock and told myself I wasn't the first person to lose a drone. People in forums lost them all the time, to gulls, to salt spray, to software. I texted Sophie, my sister, who's a marine tech, a brief, bitter joke about buying a new one. Sophie replied with a short emoji and suggested I check tide charts before I started fishing around. I laughed at myself and did, and realized the tide was definitely heading out. If the drone had fallen into shallow kelp beds, it might have beached on a rock now. That made me feel better enough to go looking at low tide. I walked the black sand and the slick rocks until my ankles got wet. Then, about 40 minutes after I'd first lost the signal, something caught in the kelp and the white shell of the drone bobbed up. It was tangled, one prop snapped, one arm gouged, but it was there. the little orange case streaked with seaweed. I dragged it up onto flat rock and sat down hard. The drone's chassis was warm, oddly warm, like it had sat near a heater. I popped the SD card out with numb fingers and waited for it to dry a minute before sliding it into my phone adapter. The video file opened, and the first frame made me laugh. Grainy ocean, the drone's own shadow over a patch of gray water. I scrolled forward to when I remembered the feed dying. At 03614, the footage was normal. The drone drifted on its station, the camera showing kelp and foam. Then, between 320 and 22, the image below the drone cut to a texture I can't name at speed. It was dark and moving, not like a boat wake or a school of fish. It wasn't water. For one frame, the whole screen filled with an almost matte black, like someone had dropped a wide piece of cloth over the lens from beneath. Then, in the next second, the camera recorded something passing underneath that blocked the entire ground. Not a shadow from above, but something with mass and edges, moving headlong across the frame. You can tell when footage is fake, when it's composited. This didn't have that uncanny flattening. The way the light wrapped and fell around it, the way small bubbles and foam clung to the edges for a fraction of a second, the refraction at the margins. All of it read like something real and wet and impossibly large had moved between the lens and the world. I scrubbed through the clip a dozen times until my thumb cramped. The object filled the frame for about a second. Then, the image stabilized on open water again, and the drone jostled like a bird had passed too close. There was no roar, no sound picked up by the microphone except the faint hiss of wind. The timestamp jumped. I noticed only later a single frame glitch in the embedded log where the camera stamped 0321 and then 321 in the very next frame. The file's external metadata showed continuous recording, no edit. But the name of the last frame before the black fill had been followed by exactly 7 minutes in the stamp. I called Sophie and left a short message. I didn't know what to say. We met at a diner later because that felt less insane than talking in my car with kelp-scent hands. I showed her the footage on my phone. She watched quiet, face getting that serious look she gets when she's trying to fit a weird sensor trace into something explainable. Could be a whale? She said, because that's what you say when you reach for rational anchors. Big humpbacks can cast weird shadows if the sun's low, or a fishing trawler's net. She paused, watching the screen. But it shouldn't match the physics on the edge like that. That looks like it was right up against the lens. I'd thought of whales and trawlers. I'd thought of cargo ships with cranes, of rogue seaweed mats. None of those matched the way the frame filled, and the abrupt digital timestamp hiccuped by 7 minutes. Sophie suggested I send the raw file to a few friends with more video tech sense. I did. A couple said like compression artifacts. One said it looked like a lens smear until he slowed it and saw the edges. None of them volunteered much beyond curiosity. People asked after the footage online and on local Facebook pages. Some joked about alien manta rays. A fisherman told me about a time-off bodega when the sea turned wrong for a minute after a storm. The harbor master said nothing. The county marine lab asked if they could have the drone. I let them borrow it for a week. They ran it through their equipment and returned the case, whispering about salt crystals and nothing that made sense. Their lead tech was more Kerestu. He handed me the ID card in a little anti-static sleeve like it was fragile glass. I still have the clip on my hard drive. I watch it sometimes at night when the house is too quiet and the tide's high and you can hear water at the bluff. The object's edges in the frame look like a skin of shadow with irregularities, folds maybe or ridges, but every time I slow it down, I'm left with the same vague, sinking feeling that it's too composed to be natural and too unadorned to be purposely made. The 7-minute stamp glitch is a thing I can reproduce on screen if I freeze and step frame, but it never explains itself. I kept the battered drone partly because it cost money, partly because I couldn't bear the idea of throwing it away, like whatever had happened could be dismissed. If anything else about that night is true, it's this. I launched a little machine into an ordinary sky, and for a breath it saw something enormous and quiet pass beneath it, something that didn't bother to make noise or waves the way I expected, and then the footage returned to making surf look lovely again. I went home, I made coffee, I upload the file now and then, watch the spot where the black comes in, and then I stop. I drive the coast sometimes at dusk, hands on the wheel, watching for anything that might throw a shadow big enough to fill the frame. Mostly I just keep the file and tell myself I was there to see it, which is a hard thing to prove and an easier thing not to admit. I drove out to my grandmother's place because the forecast said the shower would be good. Perseids, peak around midnight, the kind of thing you go see if you grew up without streetlights. Her farm sits 4 miles down a gravel road outside of York, Nebraska, a patch of sky big enough to swallow whatever falls through it. I took my old lawn chair, a thermos of coffee, and my dad's binoculars, because he'd always said binoculars catch more streaks than a telescope. My friend Lila came out with me. She's the kind of person who packs extra sweaters and a battery lantern and a bag of weird jerky she swears by. We set up behind the old corn crib where the ground dips and the horizon cuts clean. The air was hot and dry, the smell of cut alfalfa thick. Crickets filled the field in that steady, comfortable way they do at dusk. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance, and the occasional dog barked down the lane. We were both half distracted by conversation, complaining about work, about nothing, when the first oddness happened. The farmhouse lights across the road went out. Not the slow dim of a failed bulb, but a clean shut. Mr. Hargrove's porch light blinked, then the whole house turned black like someone had closed a lid. A second later, the distant highway lights went too, and the world lost that orange haze you always forget is there. "It's the grid," Lila said, frowning. "Or a storm, maybe." But the sky was clear, and the radar on my phone, when it bothered to load, showed nothing. My phone had 2 bars and then none. Lila's showed the same. We laughed at that, standing in the dark with our phones like weird little beacons, and told each other, of course, everything would fail the minute I brought a thermos of coffee. The first meteors came like any decent show, quick white lines tearing through the black. We counted 3 nice ones in the first 10 minutes and got that stupid little thrill you get when something you expect actually happens. Then the animals stopped, not gradually. The crickets, the frogs, every night noise cut out like a switch. The silence hit so sudden I could hear my own breathing. Somewhere a rooster slept into nothing. We both looked at one another, stupid smiles freezing. "Okay," Lila said, not a joke this time. "That's weird." We sat without talking for a beat, half afraid to break the quiet. Then the second odd thing. A light showed up where no meteor should be. Not streaking. Static, like a distant lamp hung in the sky. It was faint, a soft white dot higher than the corn crib and out past the trees. At first, I thought it was a plane's navigation light fooling me, but it didn't blink, and planes have the sound you can hear on a night like that. This thing made no sound. We watched as another point of light appeared, and another, a ring of pinpricks that hovered above the tree line. They weren't bright. If you weren't looking directly at them, you might mistake them for stars. But their behavior wasn't stellar. When one came on, another nearby would dim. They tilted faintly, as if testing a position. It was slow, like a clock someone wound carefully. I tried to film it with my phone. The footage looked dumb on replay. Little dots against 2 black sky. When I zoomed in, the camera's image fuzzed and then auto-corrected to the wrong exposure, and the dots turned into smears. Lila's binoculars were better. Through them, the first 3 lights had a faint blue tint, like an LED you could hold between thumb and finger. I told myself 100 rational things. That someone had a drone party, that a bloke was shining a laser from the silo, that we were tired and the sky was playing tricks. Then the lights didn't streak anymore. They hovered. Every meteor we'd expected to see as streaks were staying in place, a cluster now. Little beacons like a constellation someone was rearranging midair. Before the big movement, other small wrongs piled up. My watch, a cheap digital thing I wear and forget, blinked forward a minute and then back. The thermos lid squeaked when I unscrewed it like metal under pressure. Lila's hair stood up at the nape of her neck, like a static charge that had no wind to cause it. Dogs across the road started barking in a long communal chorus, then stopped. The farm's radio, the one that usually sits on static on the kitchen bench, chattered once with a single tone and then cut. Everything felt slightly out of sync, as if the night had picked a new tempo and we hadn't been given the sheet music. The lights began to rearrange. It took time, which made it worse. One would go dark and another, 5 degrees clockwise, would brighten until there was a perceptible line of motion. The formation grew deliberate, 4, then 6 lights coalescing into straight edges, the space between them exact, geometry you don't get by accident. They moved with the precision of people carrying a frame through fog, not the messy randomness of meteors. Lila said, "Do you see that?" Like she hoped I'd say something clever. I did the math in my head because you always do that with things you can't name. If those lights were 10 miles out, this was a calculation that made no sense. If they were close, their size would be enormous. I tossed the numbers away because numbers didn't make the hush any less heavy. As they settled, they formed a shape, a rough hexagon, edges defined by the faint dots. The interior was empty sky, but the edges were crisp and measured. For a few moments, we were actually watching a polygon hang over the corn, as casual and as impossible as a billboard in the clouds. The air changed. You could feel it. Not a breeze, but a pressure, like standing at the mouth of a cavern when someone else breathes in. My eardrums gave a soft pressure pop, and I tasted metal at the back of my throat. Lila's flashlight flickered, then steadied to a dull red glow. Her phone chimed a meaningless series of characters, and then nothing. Then, one by one, the lights winked out. Not all at once, but with a rhythm that matched the hush, folding inward like someone turning down lamps in a theater. The hexagon dissolved into pinpricks, and each pinprick blinked away until the sky was pure again. Stars, indifferent and countless. The crickets came back as if someone had flipped them on. The distant highway returned in a warm smear of engine. The perfect ordinary noises of the prairie soaked into the field, and we were left blinking at the blank night. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, listening to the ordinary reassert itself. Lila swore she saw movement inside the hex before the lights went. A shimmer, a darker place like heat over asphalt, but I couldn't tell. My camera's footage, when I finally dared to look, showed a cluster of white dots, and then a glitch frame where everything washed out, like the sensor compensated for glare. The file's timestamp hopped 3 minutes forward between 2 frames. I stared at those numbers until my eyes hurt. We packed it up slow. The gravel on the lane sounded enormous in the dark as we slid the chairs into the trunk. Mrs. Hargrove's pickup rolled down the lane with its lights back on. He gave us a wave that looked like a question. At the gate, Lila hesitated and said, "I don't know what to do with that." I told her the sensible thing. We should go home, drink coffee, pretend the world wasn't rearranging itself. And she laughed, a small, tight sound, and agreed. On the drive back into town, I kept glancing up, as if the sky might still be rearranging while I wasn't looking. It didn't. The strip mall lights had none of the solemnity of the field. People sat on porches and said the usual smalls. My phone found signal at the edge of town, and a dozen missed messages arrived from people asking if we'd seen the meteor shower. Lila texted a photo she'd taken before the geometry completed. A dark screen with a few pinpricks and the caption, "It stayed." That night, I lay awake a long time thinking about all the small wrongs that had stacked up to make the big one possible. Odd electronic hiccups, animals stopping, lights failing in a neighborhood-wide sweep, the strange pressure in the air. Those were the breadcrumbs. The hexagon felt like the only obvious thing, the one shape a human mind could settle on and say, "Yes, that is something." But even as I named it in my head, I knew that naming was not solving. The sky had done something it doesn't do. It had paused and rearranged itself like a hand sort through cards. In the morning, the county paper had a single paragraph about unusual sightings, quotes from a farmer who thought the lights were some kind of lens flare. The University Astronomy Club posted a video that showed a smear and some static and then nothing definite, and other people were arguing in the comments, which is how the internet handles everything important. Lila and I compared notes that day at a diner and kept finding small mismatches. The times we'd written down differed by seconds, our photos had different glitches, and both our watches had lost and gained minutes in ways we couldn't explain. I went back to the crib a week later during the day and found the ground trod down where we'd sat. The stalks were bent in a neat radiating pattern, not crushed but pressed, like something heavy had rested there for a while and then left. I took a picture and it looked like any field picture until I zoomed in and there was a faint, almost metallic dust in a patch that clung to the leaf. I wiped it with a glove and brought the glove home in a Ziploc because that, at least, felt like keeping evidence. I don't have a tidy ending for it. I don't have an explanation for why the meteors didn't streak or why the lights would hold and then step into geometry and wink out. All I have are the small chain of wrong things that led up to it. The silence, the phone bars dying, the watch stuttering, and the memory of a hexagon hanging over the corn like a hole cut in the sky. Sometimes at night I still look up, waiting to see if the stars will decide to move again. Mostly they don't. They keep being stars and we keep making lists. But every so often I catch myself checking my phone time or pausing when the animals go quiet. Like I'm listening for the first wrong note that would let me know the sky was thinking of rearranging once more. It was 2 in the morning when I noticed the figure in the kitchen window. I was making tea because I couldn't sleep, small, practical ritual, and the house was the kind of quiet that made the refrigerator sound too loud. The sky was the glossy black you get in winter, and there was a thin rain that had stopped about an hour earlier and left the world smelling like cold concrete. My kitchen faces the backyard. Beyond that is an alley, and then the backs of other houses. I'd lived in this place long enough to know every ordinary shadow at that hour, so when something moved in the glass, it made my mouth go dry. At first, it was just a smudge, a darker smudge against the dim reflection of my island light. Then the shape traced a gesture, one slow, deliberate arc like someone pushing back a sleeve. Not a full silhouette, not a person you could identify, just the suggestion of shoulders and a head, a vertical presence that matched no tree branch. The movement was a fraction out of phase with my own. I lifted the kettle to my cheek to warm my hands and watched it. The figure moved when I didn't, and when I thought about the shape as a reflection, there was a wrongness to it. It seemed to have depth behind the glass rather than on the same plane as the kitchen. I opened the blinds on the sliding door because the only honest thing to do was look. The backyard puddled under the deck. The oak's leaves beaded with water, and a trash can leaned a little farther into the alley than usual. There was nothing moving. No person, no cat, no raccoon, just the slow mist and a porch light throbbing like a heartbeat. When I closed the blinds again, the figure remained for a moment exactly where it had been in the glass. It felt like a smear the world could keep even when the real thing had gone. Then it dissolved, softly back into the ordinary reflection of my oven light. I stood there for a long time doing what you do, making up explanations. Headlights, catching a curtain, someone on a ladder outside a neighbor's house, my own shadow doubled. My phone lay face down on the counter and I flipped it to check the time. 2:07, and texted Liza, my friend who worked nights, not because I wanted company, but because it's easier to say a small, ordinary thing to someone who answers when your brain feels much larger than the room. Her reply came back in a minute. Go to bed, Nate. She always kept things short. I poured the tea and noticed the clock over the stove flick. It jumped from 2:09 to 2:14 and then steadied. I laughed a little at that. Cheap digital clocks do that when the power dips. The oven display blipped too, all zeros for a heartbeat. The house didn't lose lights. Everything stayed on, but there was a thin metallic ringing in my teeth, barely audible, like the hum you hear in old hospital rooms. I told myself not to make a thing out of electrical gremlins and thought about how stupid I was for standing at the window at that hour. The next oddity was Scout, the neighbor's golden, who sleeps half his life under my kitchen window like he owns the yard. He was inside his own house that night. I'd heard him earlier when Liza let him in for the night. But when I walked to the sink, he started to bark once. A long, single bark that was half alarm and half question. I froze, and the sound didn't repeat. The curtains at the neighbor's kitchen twitched. They always did when someone moved inside, but it was a tiny twitch like a breath. I opened the blinds again and looked straight into the backyard with the porch light throwing a yellow smear along the wet boards. Still nothing out there. I took a photo of the window with the phone because that's what people do now. Proof, data, something to show. The image was a grainy square of my island light and a darker obscurity where the figure had been. But when I zoomed, the file was overexposed in that area and gave me nothing useful. The pixels would resolve to nothing but a fuzz, like the camera had politely refused to record. I swiped the phone off and set it face down again because staring at a screen at that hour makes the mind run tangents. Around 2:25, the street outside snapped to life like someone had lit a match. A car door banged, a bike squeaked by, and a neighbor's porch light came on with the annoyed stutter those bulbs have when the wiring is old. People scream and retire to their beds, I thought. Someone else is awake, which made me feel marginally safer, the way sharing weirdness dilutes its weight. I took a pull of my tea and felt ridiculous for being on edge. Then there was the knock on the back door. Not the quick, polite rattle of a package delivery. This was 3 slow, measured knocks, hardly louder than a tap. I looked over my shoulder at the sound, and my heart did a little confusing flip. The back door has 2 locks and a chain, and the porch light outside spills its thin halo across the deck. I had already seen no one outside. The scene was familiar in a way that made the knock feel like a mise-en-scène. I checked the chain and the deadbolt and stood with the door slightly ajar and the blinds creased at my back. No footsteps, no one knocking again, only the regular distant sound of rain slapping gutters and a dog somewhere down the block, revving into a bark and then calming. Maybe a neighbor had mistaken my house for theirs. Maybe someone was drunk. Maybe the wind had thrown a branch against the wood in such a rhythm that it counted as knocking. My mouth tasted like pennies. I called out, "Hello," and got only the echo of my own voice. After 10 minutes and 3 more single knocks that arrived like a metronome, 1 pause, I went out on the porch with my teacup like armor. The cold bit through the robe and my slippers left soft prints on the mat. I peered around the yard and down the alley. The trash can was tipped the same way as before. The air smelled of wet leaves and oil from cars. Nothing was there. No footprints, no flashlight beam, no person leaning against the neighbor's fence. When I stood still, the knocking didn't repeat. It felt deliberate and gone all at once. The rest of the night narrowed to small checks. I walked the perimeter of the house in my socks, and the gravel crunch felt loud in the quiet. The security camera over the garage recorded the expected blob of streetlight and nothing else at 2:32. The timestamp, crisp and mechanical. On the playback, there was a brief shimmer, 3 frames of a darker smear that the software smoothed into noise when you sped the clip up. Alone, scrutinized, it resolved into nothing helpful. I made myself a list-like set of things that could explain all of it. Faulty wiring, an animal, an overworked neighbor, my own tired mind. The rational list kept expanding, to cover the uncomfortable fact that the window had showed me motion that wasn't there and the door had been knocked as if by someone polite who didn't want to announce themselves. You build explanations because the world insists on being answerable, and we like the relief of being right. Finally, around 3, I went to bed, but not before I did the small human things you do when the night feels like it could tilt. I double-checked the locks, I set the kettle within reach, and I left the kitchen light on. I slept in fits with one eye open to the clock. Once I dreamed that someone stood at the window and mouthed my name, but the letters were wrong and tasted like metal. I woke and blinked at the ceiling, and the house was ordinary in the way houses become ordinary when you remember to breathe. In the morning, the world was the kind of mundane that feels almost obscene after a night like that. Kids waiting for the school bus, the neighbor with his paper, the mail carrier who makes a point to whistle when he reaches our porch. I checked the outside of the sliding door for prints and found nothing beyond the expected smears of rain. Scout lay at his kitchen mat and wagged when I knocked on the wall between our houses. Liza came by with 2 mugs because, of course, she did. "You texted me weird," she said, smiling like the serious business of nighttime texts had become a joke we could agree on. She asked whether the camera recorded anything. I let her look at the last clip and we replayed it a few times. The software showed the window as a black square and 3 frames of static where there might have been a shape. For whatever reason, those three frames refused to resolve into a person, only noise, as if the night had decided not to be captured. Later, over coffee, she said something practical, I suppose, to steady both of us. Sometimes there are echoes of things. Reflections catch someone in the neighbor's yard, or a passing car makes a pattern that looks like movement. I thought of that often over the next week, because that's how you live when something small and unexplained has brushed you. You test normality until it fits again. A Monday later, I found an old photograph in a box in the attic. It was of this house when that maple was a sapling, the kids on the block playing in the yard. The edges of the photo were worn and the glass had a hairline crack. When the sun hit it just so, the reflection inside the framed image showed a smudge in the same exact place I'd seen the figure, a darker suggestion where a head might be. I couldn't explain why a photograph taken decades ago would behave like that, but I wrapped the frame back in its paper and put it under the bed like a small private relic. I took apart the kitchen clock and found the little capacitor swollen and replaced it. The oven received a technician's visit and its circuits tested fine. The house felt, in the end, like itself again. Fixtures fixed, devices behaving. And yet, something in me remained alert in the way a person stays alert after a loud noise, more attentive to small sounds, to the way shadows settle. A month later, a friend told me about a similar thing at her aunt's place upstate, a reflection that didn't match any person, and a single knock that showed on camera and then failed to show. She laughed about it like we laugh about the weather. We both knew those laughs were a way to keep our feet. I keep the blinds halfway open now when I make tea in the middle of the night. It's less about watching the yard and more about watching myself watch it. Sometimes the window will throw back a smear when the light catches it just right, and I'll stop and look, and sometimes I won't see anything at all. The house hums, the clocks keep time, and life moves through days that insist on predictability. If the figure ever comes back, I will do what I did before. Look, confirm, call someone if I have to, drip tea on the counter, and try to rehearse the things that made sense. For now, the one certain detail is this. When the blinds are wide and the glass is dark, the world gives you a hint of something that looks like a presence, and you have to decide whether to name it or keep it unnamed. I left the kettle on the stove for a while after that night, the little blue light like a heartbeat, and in the mornings I make a point of seeing the house light up again, small domestic demonstrations that the ordinary can return, even if it has to be asked politely. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, one of those short, sharp vibrations that wakes you without the guilt of the full alarm. I blinked up at the ceiling and saw it was 2:11 a.m. The text preview said only, "Go outside. Look west." Maya's name on my screen was enough to make me put my feet on the floor. She's the sort of friend who texts like she's telling you a small, urgent secret, never the long explanations at 1 a.m, just the imperative. I grabbed my robe, shoved my feet into slippers, and padded to the back door. Outside, the air hit me hard and cold. It had been a warm day, but the night slipped sharp as knives. The backyard lights were off. I didn't expect anything. Maya lives 2 blocks over, and she doesn't bother watching the sky at ungodly hours. The west was a deep black behind the line of oaks that runs along the edge of our neighborhood. No stars because the tree line ate them. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw it, a single red point of light, steady as a laser, hanging right above the tree line. Not blinking, just there, perfectly round, and the kind of red you don't see from an airplane. Too thin, like an LED you could hold between your fingers. It was maybe the size of a thumbnail at arm's length. My first thought was a drone, except there was no drone sound, no whirring, no breeze. The night felt too still to hold the idea of rotors. I texted back, "Where are you?" while still squinting. Her reply came almost immediately. "At the corner. It's been there 10 min, it's getting closer." I stayed on the porch even though every sensible thing in me said go back inside. The light didn't change for a beat, then seemed to resolve, like when you stop trying to read a smudge on glass and suddenly it becomes a word. I blinked, because blinking is basic human reflex and a way to stall, and when my eyes opened, the light was subtly closer. Closer enough that the space between the tree trunks that framed it made it look like it was sitting in the branches now instead of above them. I checked the back door handle with the side of my hand, half expecting to find it warm. It was cool. The sound of the neighborhood was wrong in ways I'd notice after. The distant highway that usually thrummed like some steady creature was a thin hiss. The frogs that used to be loud this time of year were silent. A dog barked twice somewhere to the east, and then not again. You don't fully register those absences until something else happens. The porch light flickered. Not the bulb, the whole fixture flicked like someone had blinked a switch, once and again, then steadied. My phone slid down to no bars for a second, then jumped back. I thought of calling the non-emergency line, of calling Maya's number, but the thought of moving away from the light felt like surrendering a vantage point. I wanted to keep looking. It drifted closer in still small steps, not the skitter of a drone, but the confidence of a thing that knows its path. Each time it moved, it seemed to slide between trunks as if finding a hole in the canopy to fit through. At one point, it was low enough I could see a faint halo around it where the leaves caught color and dropped back to green lightless. The red itself didn't spread. It just sat in the center like a bead of lacquer. Maya came up on my porch a minute later, her jog clothes on, hair wrapped in a messy bun, eyes wide and breath visible from the cold. She didn't say hello. She only held up her phone for a second like a talisman and mouthed, "Closer, right?" I nodded. She stepped up to the rail and wrapped her hands around it like someone holding onto a boat. She told me later she'd walked out just to see if I was awake. There's a neighborly absurdity in that. Two adults at 2 a.m, gauging light across a line of trees like watchmen. We stood there in companionable silence while the thing kept nearing. Nothing else in the yard moved. A moth hit the kitchen window with a soft, wet thud. That was all. I tried the cheap zoom on my phone. The image came up grainy, the red resolved to a small circle with a faint inner dot that suggested depth, like it had a center and a shell. The audio picked up nothing beyond the soft rustle of leaves not being moved. Even the sound absentness felt too measured. I hit record because against better judgment I wanted evidence. Even now, I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to prove to myself that I had not been hallucinating. When you watch something unnatural get closer, your brain does a weird inventory of the familiar. If that's a drone, I can hear the rotors. If it's a lantern someone's walking, I can see their motion. None of that fit. This red light moved with neither animal haste nor mechanical clumsy. It slid with a deliberation that was the opposite of panic, the kind of calm that makes your skin crawl. At one point, the light hovered low enough that I could have thrown a soft toss and hit the branch it hovered over. I blinked, an involuntary reflex blink, and when I opened my eyes, it was closer again. Not dramatically, not an enormous leap. The kind of move you only notice when you blink, like a chess piece slid under your nose when you weren't looking. The hair on my arms pulled up. Maya saw it too. She breathed out a laugh that held no humor, more a noise of disbelief. "It blinked," she said. "When I closed my eyes, it was here." I rationalized, as human beings do, that our perceptions were playing cruel tricks because of the cold and the lack of sleep. We argued in a whisper about whether to wake her husband, whether to call 911, whether one should call 911 for a suspicious light in the trees. We opted for caution and called him anyway. He answered, voice thick and half asleep, and agreed to come look. While we waited, the neighborhood did that single curious thing people do. Neighbors emerged, one in flannel, one with a flashlight, another barefoot in a robe. There were 5 of us now, a small audience on a long, narrow stage of a street. Someone joked about aliens, and the laugh came out too sharp. Everyone's phone camera failed to convey the exactness of the red. On screen, it was more like a smear, a blotchy postage stamp of crimson against black. Ethan, the guy from 2 doors down, climbed onto his truck bed to get a better angle and slipped a quarter turn on the top of his boot. He swore under his breath. When he steadied himself, the light had shifted again, closer to the line of houses. That's when the sense in the group changed. What had been curiosity rippled into something like awareness. We had moved from watchers to noticed. Maya's husband pulled into the street in his robe with a flashlight and a baseball cap. He got out and stood with his hands in his pockets. He didn't have a long speech. Nobody did. We stood together and watched one small red dot move from branch to branch like someone walking a wire. A car rolled slowly past down the road, and the driver slowed, craned his neck, then went on, eyes wide. The light didn't flinch. Then the dogs started. A chorus from a dozen yards down started a staccato set of yelps and then silence. The red light dipped and went behind the dense part of the trees, and for a moment we saw nothing. I blinked. Mechanical now, a reflex I couldn't shake, and when my eyes cleared, it was farther down the row, almost at the house line, the red getting brighter and more resolved, like some small reality had accreted into being as it descended. Past that point, logic and self-preservation are thin.